the reason I want to speak to you today was because Wes Huff obviously made the video and I responded. Gavin Ortland responded to that, and he made a comment saying that he, at least for now, isn't going to respond to that. The only other sort of big player in the game here with regular viewers making regular content about this is you, or are you too, I suppose.
It's
Ruslan. Look, I can't see Wes Huff sort of hopping on a conversation anytime soon. So let's do it this way, perhaps. I wondered what you make of where we're up to, because as far as I can tell, what's happened is Wes Huff made a claim about the Isaiah scroll on Joe Rogan, which is not correct. He admitted that he was not correct, that he misspoke, but is still trying to salvage the point and indicate that Joe Rogan should still be amazed and would still be amazed if he heard the same thing. Now, I don't know if you've seen this, but just a few days ago, Joe Rogan had another episode. I can't remember who the guest was. It's Kip Davis who brought this to my attention. And right near the end of the podcast, Rogan says, I just posted on Twitter, Rogan says, I just had that Wesley Huff on. And something that I've been thinking about, I can't stop thinking about it, is that the Isaiah scroll that they found from like 1,000 years ago is verbatim the same as the one they've got today. It literally word for word. Like, I can't stop thinking about it. Now, I understand that people think that a sort of 93.5% at best fidelity with the Masoretic text is still like really impressive. Yes, I mean, that's the calculation that Dan McClellan came to by assuming that every single textual variant only applied to one word, when actually they apply to sometimes entire sentences and verses. If you just ran down to one per word, then you get I think it's 93% fidelity. So it's got to be lower than that, but it's at best, 93%. People say that's still kind of amazing, but I don't think Joe Rogan would be having this other guest on going like, dude, I literally can't stop thinking about the fact that like the Isaiah scroll is like 93%. I just don't think it would have the same apologetic weight for him. So this is obviously doing something for him and his listeners that was a mistake that I called out. And in response to that, people are telling me that, I don't know, that I'm nitpicking, or that it doesn't matter, or that Wes Huff was essentially right all along. So I want to know where you stand on that.
Sure. So first of all, do you have a heart out? Because I have a ton of stuff I would love to talk to you about. And props to you for, I think you're debating David Wood. What is it, February 15th, 16th? I was excited to hopefully meet you in person there.
That's right.
So props to you for that. And I want to give a big shout out to Modern Day Debate for hosting that. And I'll be there, and hopefully people come and see you. Yeah, so I actually, okay, so you just laid out a couple different things. And I actually have a bit of correspondence from Wes himself for you that we can get into in a minute. So this is what I would say. Props to you for doing, and I don't mean to derail the conversation. Do you have a heart out, Alex? Because I don't want to keep you longer.
No.
Like, how much time you don't? Okay, sweet. Okay,
we can keep this going reasonably.
Let me just say this. Let me just give you your flowers. I feel like I've given you your flowers in every video I've made about you, but I want to give you your flowers to your face. Props to you for doing the heavy lifting for us with conversations like Jordan Peterson. I think you got something out of him that many of us were hoping to get out of him. And I thought that was great. And so props to you for that. I think you do a good job of steel manning Christianity. I think this idea of, I think you describe yourself as being a non-combative, non-believer is very fascinating. And so overall, like, it seems like you've evolved in terms of some of your content. Some atheists kind of go from like the quote unquote cage stage of atheism. We have that in Christianity, the cage stage of Christianity, and we just like put you in a cage and don't let you touch anybody. And it seems like you really evolved past that. So props to you for that. So here's the thing. You didn't watch my response yesterday, did you? With my interview with Dan McClellan.
I did. I've seen, I think, everything you've put out regarding the Isaiah scroll.
Okay.
At least sort of watched it in the background.
Yeah. So when I had Dan McClellan on, the issue came up is, I want to say Peter Thiel, his mentor, in a video said 99% the same. Okay.
Yep.
Dan McClellan said, well, he was just in a religious context. I think it's not. I think he thought it was 95% the same. Dan McClellan then says it's 93% the same. That's kind of the figure you're throwing out. He said that he wouldn't have had a problem with Wes saying it was 99% the same. Okay?
Yeah, right.
So to me, if Dan is saying, hey, I don't have a problem if Wes would have said 99% the same, you're saying it's 93% the same. I understand that word for word, verbatim is not useful. I get it. I do want to point out that I don't know if this
not
is
helpful. It's incorrect, right?
If we're in a conversation and I say, hey, Alex, these two people I know got into an argument, and man, I was shocked that word for word they gave me the same recollection of the argument, right? I think it's assumed that I'm not giving you a academic encyclopedia. I got word for word the same. The gist of what was said from both sides of an argument, and I'm impressed by the argument. I'm going, man, these guys really represented the same side of the argument. I think that's a fair statement to say. Do I think Wes could have been more precise? Yes, I think Wes could have been more precise.
That's because of the context, right? Like if you...
The context, yeah.
If I said to you, like, man, this guy I was talking to, like, said word for word the same story, you might then say something like, what, word for word? And I'd probably go, well, obviously not word for word. But the thing is, if I said, you know, I received 2 letters in the post from 2 of my friends, and you know what's really weird? They are like word for word identical. You said word for word? I went, yeah, verbatim. Then I think you would assume that I was actually talking about the words being exactly the same, because we're talking about a written text here. What we're doing here is...
So you're saying Joe Rogan's clarifying question is what makes you feel like it was over the top? Like had he said word for word and then there wasn't a clarifying question, then it wouldn't have bugged you as much? Is that fair?
No, I still think that would have been a problem. But what I mean to say is that Rogan was clearly interpreting this to mean, well, what Wes said, which is word for word. Now, I am of the opinion that Wes just got this wrong, that he was mistaken. And that's fine. As I've said in my video, the problem is not with the mistake. The problem is with the response trying to salvage the point, saying that he was essentially correct, which I don't think is the case, given the parameters that we're talking about here, right? Because there are a few things we need to separate. One is the importance of this word for word thing, right? Suppose it were the case that the Isaiah scroll was actually word for word identical with the Masoretic text, like word for word, even like orthographic spelling, right? In that case, I think a lot of Christians would want to say the Holy Spirit is doing some God breathing here. Like there's obviously something going on. And if it turned out that one of those words was wrong, it would still be really impressive, but it would just hit this idea that there is some kind of like hard and fast evidence that the Holy Spirit is guiding this process, because there's at least one mistake, which means it's still like really, really incredible and sick. Sure. But the argument that this is being like, you know, like locked down by the Holy Spirit would go out the window with one mistake like that. So the fact that there are so many means that we're moving from talking about a text which is like suspiciously similar to one which is just like pretty standardly similar.
It sounds like we're getting now into, if I'm tracking correctly, you're getting into what you believe inerrancy means, and that's not. I don't think that's what was being argued here.
No, not quite. What I'm saying
because that was Dan's issue. Dan was saying, hey, because there's some variance, this then harms the doctrine of inerrancy. That was his initial point, and I hold to a different view of inerrancy, and I'm not sure if I'm sure you would know that there's variations of what we mean by inerrancy and scripture being reliable and generally true versus every iota and every dot being perfect. And then I'm seeing this like backdooring of like miracle being dropped in. I don't remember Wes saying anything about a miracle, that the way it was preserved was a miracle.
So Wes wasn't doing any of that. What I mean to say is the reason this is important is because as a listener, when you hear this, a 93% fidelity might still impress you. A 95% or 99% would really impress you as a listener. You might think, wow, that's incredible. But to the naive listener of Joe Rogan who doesn't know much about the subject, when they hear that it's 100%, that's going to make them think there's something suspicious going on. And they might start to construct these ideas.
See, I think we're getting into what people can perceive. I see Myth Vision in the podcast, and he says Joe took it as a miracle on his show with Wes. I think we're starting to assume how Joe took it as a miracle.
No, he did because he said that. Later in the podcast, he brings it up again, and he says,
"It was a miracle." Joe said it was a miracle.
Joe said that itself is a miracle. He said those words.
Oh, okay, I got you. Okay. So so later on. So that's my mistake. So if later on Joe said it was a miracle,
so he does say I
don't think it needs to be presented as a miracle. I didn't hear Wes presenting it as a miracle. If Wes presented it,
can you see how?
I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. Go ahead. So what I'm saying is, if Wes presented it as a miracle, maybe he shouldn't have presented it as a miracle. If Joe Rogan took it as a miracle, I don't even know if it needs to be taken as a miracle. But here's what I'm getting at. And you keep saying 93%. Again, Dan McClellan's mentor, teacher, who he cited, said 99%. Dan McClellan said it would have been okay with 99%. So my issue becomes, Alex, is
not that he would have been correct. Dan doesn't mean that he would have been correct. He just means he would have been okay with it.
So if the conversation goes 99% the same, greatest archaeological discovery ever, people were ecstatic, excited. This is revolutionary. Dan's words. These are Dan's words, Alex. He wouldn't have had an issue with it. I think the response to Joe Rogan is still, wow. I think the response is still the same. I think the information is still taken the same. And this is what I mean by we're splitting hairs over word for word in a conversational setting where, yes, again, conceded. He used hyperbole. He was in a 3-hour high pressure situation. He said he misspoke. He said he should have said that. And he said why. Now, does that change the impact of the statement? Does that change the reality of the statement? I don't think it does. And this is where I think, yes, Wes was essentially right.
Okay, a few things to say. The first is that you keep saying hyperbole, and Wes has said this as well. This doesn't strike me as hyperbole. This doesn't strike me as, I mean, hyperbole I think is defined as like an intentional exaggeration of affairs. So if he was intentionally doing it, then I think that's quite bad. At best, it's an accident. It's like an accidental hyperbolic statement, which is just to say that he was incorrect. Like to say it's hyperbolic might be that when it was 90%, he said it was 95. But to say, like, I think there is actually a category difference between like really, really correct and completely correct, no matter how really, really correct we're talking about. Like that 91 to 99% is, yeah, significant in various ways, but it's a category difference to saying it is word for word identical. I think it was just a mistake. And I think I would appreciate if people, including Wes himself, would stop dressing it up in the language of precision or hyperbole and just say, yeah, it was incorrect and I should have said this instead. It's not unhelpful, well, it's wrong.
Okay, fair enough. So here's the thing. So again, correspondence I'm getting is that they're digging deeper into this. So I would just say this. So the correspondence I'm getting is that one, Dan is not an Old Testament textual critic, okay, and that is not his area of expertise, and that he's working with people. This is Wes. He was okay with me relaying this to you, that he is working with people who are currently publishing in the areas Dan and Kip are commenting on, but they aren't publishing nor have been actively in the field for over a decade. Okay. And he said he's going to be recording a video with a top Old Testament textual critic that's going to be presenting some actual numbers in light of Dan's inaccurate numbers. Likewise, Kip, who said Alex's video is the guy who wrote the variant list, has told me that that was hyperbolic. So he's working on this with a group that has actually scanned, this is what Wes is saying, that has actually scanned the entire Great Isaiah Scroll Codex L and has the most updated variant list, which not only showed the outdated numbers Dan is citing to be incarnate, but wildly off. And if it comes up between you, then he says, I'm free. So that's what Wes is working on right now. So maybe the verdict is still out. Because again,
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. So when I looked at the stuff Dan put on the screen, Alex, and the word is highlighted 5 times. I'm sorry, Alex. Yes, he's nitpicking, brother. Respectfully, he is nitpicking. And I said that to him to his face. When you got 9 variants and one of them is the word "and" circled 5 times, is it some big bombshell? And Christianity will never survive because the word "and" was inserted. Alex, it's honestly ridiculous, man. And that's what I'm getting at. And so I understand your frustration. I get it. But what I'm saying is when we get into this hyper literal nitpickiness that, yes, technically, everyone has conceded, Alex. I'm with you, man. Everyone has conceded. Wes should have been more precise. It's a 3-hour conversation.
No. He was wrong. You're doing it again. But also, look. Okay, I've got to jump in here because there is so much to say. Like a moment ago when you said, well, look, I don't remember Wes making that argument about miracles, despite the fact that Joe Rogan did interpret it that way. I haven't made the argument that you just said. I don't think that because the word "the" is missing in the book of Isaiah a few times that Christianity is undermined, right? And that, by the way, is an example of speaking hyperbolically, what you were just doing. That's hyperbole, right?
That was Dan's claims, Alex. Dan put a screen grab
let me finish. And you've got to let me finish it.
Fair enough.
That was what I mean by hyperbole is when you just said, you sort of parodied the position and said, like, come on, Alex, this is ridiculous. Like the fact that 5 out of 7 of these variants are the word "the," that doesn't disprove Christianity. It's like, I know, I wouldn't argue that it does. If you watch the video carefully, what we first address is the idea that most of these are orthographical spelling, which is false. Now, the list of 2,600 variants comes from volume 32 of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert, which is the official editorial publication, the first publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the editors actually say that the variants are so many that detailed analysis can't be offered, and someone else will have to do that at a later date. So it's quite clear that this is an ongoing conversation, even since the publication of that journal, right? And there could be another look at the Isaiah scroll, which shows a different list of variants, maybe far less variants, whatever the case. But the first thing I was clearing up was that they're mostly spelling. That's false. Then The next question is, are all of these insignificant? Because that's the big question, is if all of them are just things like the word the, or variances in speaking, the first important thing to point out is that there's a difference between like textual significance as a technical term and let's say theological significance. So for example, if in one text it says, I went to the shop and I bought some milk, and in the other one it said, upon entering the shop I saw some milk and I decided to buy it because I like milk, right? Those textually are like highly significant difference. That's a significant textual difference, but it's a completely insignificant theological difference, right? So I understand that we might be talking about two different things here.
Fair enough.
So the question is, what about the significant like readings of the text? That is when I therefore bring up chapter 2, verse 9b and verse 10. Those verses, as you know, are missing from the Isaiah scroll. They're not in there. This is not the removal of a the. This is not the difference in a word order. This is a missing verse entirely, which begins with the words "do and do not forgive them," which is quite a dramatic injunction from the speaker. And interestingly, it seems to switch from speaking about in terms of like who it's addressing, whether it's addressing God or whether it's addressing people. So there are a lot of reasons other than just the fact that we have variant verses of versions of this verse to think that it's a later edition. That verse is missing. Now, the reason I hone in on that is because there are something like 9 isolated and interpretive insertions identified by the journal. This is one of them. Do you think that is a significant difference, a significant variant?
Because there's a verse missing?
Yeah. 1.5 verses.
Alex, my Bible, any modern Bible that you pick up is going to have little captions in almost every translation that says the last 11 verses of Mark are not found in earlier manuscripts. The stoning of the woman at the well caught in the act of adultery, not the woman at the well, excuse me, the woman caught in the act of adultery, that is not in the, so no, I don't think that's a significant
they don't do that for
differences.
Isaiah.
Yeah, I don't think. What do you mean? What do they do for Isaiah? You're saying
I don't think at least the NIV doesn't highlight that.
Okay, so maybe in the NIV doesn't, but I'm sure there's other ones that say these verses may not be in the early variants. I mean, in the early manuscripts, these things are added all over. Like there's entire 11 verses missing. So what I'm saying to you is, if we're now splitting hairs on is that a significant change in the text, then we have to get into what do we mean by significant. I don't think that verses from thousands of years ago, a verse missing here, 11 verses missing in Mark that aren't in it, I don't think that's a significant difference. I don't think that, and you conceded already that it doesn't change anything theologically, right? So it doesn't change anything theologically.
Here's a point that Dan has asked some people and hasn't had a response for. I don't know if he asked this to you. What level of fidelity would be troublesome to you? Like we've got about 93%. Say it's 95, say it's 99, whatever it is that you think it is. How much would bother you? Like would 75% bother you? Or like 70%? Like at what point would you say, actually, this is an indication that the text has altered?
So when we're talking, what you're asking me is how many missing verses? Is that, I just want to make sure I'm gathering.
Well, yeah, let's say missing verses and fine. How many missing verses are we talking about that would be troublesome?
So your question is, just so we're clear, theologically it doesn't make a difference. But your question is, even if it theologically doesn't make a difference, what amount of missing verses would make me hold for concern? Am I tracking correctly?
I think the question is evolving as we speak, so let me pin this down. How many verses in their entirety would have to be missing? And let's just grant that they can be all, as far as you judge them, not theologically significant verses.
Sure.
But all verses, how many of them would have to be missing before you think that Wes Huff going on Joe Rogan and saying that the text is word for word identical?
Oh, okay. So you're talking about specifically Wes Huff. Well, we already talked about that the verdict is out on how much is and isn't missing. We already talked about the discrepancies between these percentages. We already talked that Wes is actually sitting down with an Old Testament textual critic, like an actual Old Testament textual critic, and they're going to scan through all these verses, and I don't know how they're going to get into it. So I think if a book is shorter, if a book is 20% shorter, if a seventh of it is missing, it doesn't change anything for me, Alex. Like it really doesn't. Example, I don't think those are significant.
Nobody points to the book of Jeremiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls as like in the same way that they point to Isaiah, because
there's more stuff missing from Jeremiah. Yeah, I know.
Because there's a bunch missing. And people, if I went on Joe Rogan and said that Jeremiah was like word for word identical, you'd be like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense.
It's a seventh shorter. I understand.
What I'm asking you is like, what's your tolerance here? Because if I said that of Jeremiah, you'd agree that it was misleading. But if I said of Isaiah, which is also missing verses, it's kind of okay. Like, how many missing verses are we allowed here?
But he didn't make that claim about Jeremiah. He made that claim about Isaiah, and Isaiah, we would say points to the suffering servant and is a prophetic book about the gospel and Jesus dying and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, okay, so maybe I'm not tracking you.
He didn't talk about Jeremiah. He didn't talk about Jeremiah, right? But what I'm saying is, if I spoke about Jeremiah in that way, you would happily just concede that it was incorrect.
If you went on Joe Rogan and you said Jeremiah is word for word the same in these thousands of years manuscripts, if you went on there and said that,
yep,
would I concede that and there's a seventh of it missing? Would I say you were incorrect?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, first of all, I probably wouldn't say it incorrect because I wouldn't find that point that interesting. And then if you said it, I'd just be like, yeah. Say that one more time because I asked.
If you're asked, or say Wes Huff said this and I criticized him and said that's not correct. It's like,
if Wes Huff said Jeremiah is word for word the same and a seventh of it is missing, and you then made the video that you made, a seventh of it is missing. Sorry. You made the video you made. I would say, Wes Huff needs to clean it up. He needs to explain why he got it wrong or who was he thinking of on the spot. And I would say, yeah, that's a more
because I said the same thing about Wes Huff with the missing verses in Isaiah. There was much less
so I got you. Okay.
At what point does it become a problem?
Yeah. So for me, a problem, 90% is not a problem. That's an A- in any circle. Like it just doesn't become a problem for me. So if we're just talking 75%, 60%, I think maybe there's something to be had when someone's making the claim word for word. This is what I'm getting at, Alex. When we're saying word for word, it's a conversation. We're having a conversation, just like when people use the word literally and they don't mean literally. I think it's a conversation and there should be grace extended there. Now, again, West is going back and he is sitting with a textual scholar, an actual textual critic of the Old Testament, which is not Dan's expertise, and they're going through those actual variants that were called out, and they're redoing the math on how many variants are there actually, if those numbers are being exaggerated, the 2,000 number. So does that answer your question? Do you feel like I gave you a reasonable answer?
Not exactly. Although I also don't want to belabor the point, but the reason I don't think it answers is because, look, I'm glad you brought that up because I have also heard that Wes is working on this with some names. I have been told who those people are, but I don't know very much about them, and I don't want to speak about them publicly as well, especially if their names haven't been revealed. All we can say on that point is like when that comes out, we'll look at it. But I'm not sure about the scope of the project. I'm not sure if it will do what you want it to do here.
Fair enough.
The point that I'm making here, right, is we're tracking a debate that's been happening that starts with Wes Huff on Joe Rogan, starts with this Billy Carson guy, although I don't actually even really know who that guy is. I didn't watch that. Wes Huff on Rogan says that the text is word for word identical. I say that that's incorrect. And then what we have here is an exercise in the laborious shifting of goalposts, because at first it's word for word identical. Then it's, okay, it's not word for word identical, but it's all mostly spelling. Then I make another video and it's like, okay, it's not actually mostly all spelling, but all the variants are insignificant. And then it's, okay, there is actually an entire missing verse, but that verse shows up elsewhere. And it's like, okay, actually it doesn't show up in its entirety elsewhere and it still varies, but like it doesn't change our theological reading of Isaiah, which is like a totally different claim. Like if Wes Huff had gone on Joe Rogan and said, we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls the scroll of Isaiah, and it was so similar, like unbelievably similar to the Masoretic text, that like we realized that our theological reading of it is like exactly the same. I'd be like, cool, yeah, good, good for you. Sure, but that's not what he did. He got it wrong, and he admitted that he got it wrong. And he admitted that he got it wrong because he was misremembering quotes about 1Q Isaiah B, which is a different document. So I don't think that I'm nitpicking here. I don't think I'm clutching at straws. I think I'm pointing out a mistake and not having an appropriate response.
Yeah, but can you concede how it could come off nitpicky? Out of a 3-hour conversation, out of a 3-hour conversation, Wes Huff has with Joe Rogan, where Joe Rogan repeatedly criticizes atheism. He repeatedly says all kinds of interesting things. Out of a 3-hour conversation here, the thing that Dan McClellan, who's not an Old Testament textual critic, Kip, I don't know Kip's...
Kip is like a leading expert in the field.
Okay, so I don't know anything about Bible scholarship. I don't know anything about Kip besides him telling me to get off his lawn. Okay, so I don't know anything about Kip. And the thing that people zone in on is this word for word versus 99%. I think that's nitpicky. We could disagree on that, and you could say, but I'm, and Wes has already said, technically, yes, I should have been more precise. That was the very first thing
you're doing it again. You're doing it again. Technically, I should have been more precise. Why can't he just say he was wrong? I want him to say he was wrong.
So, Alex, listen very carefully.
Also, by the way, I must respond just quickly before we move on to this point. You say it's nitpicky, right?
It is nitpicky, Alex.
And could you say out of a 3-hour conversation, there's this one thing. This is the takeaway that Joe Rogan had from this podcast. This is what he remembered.
Okay, because he said it in the future. If he said it in a future episode.
And 2 days ago, he said that this is the thing that's been keeping him up at night. And do you know the reason I saw it? Because somebody clipped him talking about it on that second podcast and turned it into a YouTube short where all the comments are saying, praise Jesus, how brilliant the Bible is. This is obviously doing a lot of apologetical heavy lifting and is quite important for that reason. It's not nitpicking. If I'd have picked up one thing that Wes Huff had said that nobody remembered, nobody was talking about, and didn't have any apologetic relevance, then fair enough. But I've picked the one thing that Rogan himself has identified as the most important takeaway from that podcast.
Yeah, but you picked it before Rogan identified it, Alex.
Won't say that he's wrong.
Alex, you picked it before Rogan identified it and reshared it. So you had already...
That's not true.
What do you mean it's not true?
In the same podcast.
You just said it was 2 days ago. You just said later, as in 2 days ago. I don't know the timelines. Maybe I'm mishearing you. You said 2 days ago, Rogan said it again, right?
So there's 2 occasions where he's repeated it. Once is 2 days ago in the new podcast, but the other is later in that same podcast where he brings it up again, remembers it from earlier, and describes it as a miracle. So it's obviously quite important to Joe Rogan.
Okay, so when did you decide to make this the thing that you wanted to pick apart of Wes? Was it after the 2 references from Joe Rogan, the 2 public mentions of it, or before?
No. Oh, sorry.
So before.
After the first one. After the first one.
Okay. So you heard it the first time. You heard it the first time, and had he not said it the first time, would you have left it alone and been like, okay, maybe he misspoke? 99%. Some scholars say 99%. The verdict is out. We need to compile these variants. Yes, there's some verses. Would you have left it alone had it not stuck to Rogan as something that he repeated? I'm genuinely curious at this point.
Of course, I don't know. I want to say probably I would have still addressed it, because the other important thing to note is that my original video spent 2 minutes on the Isaiah scroll. And the reason that it was up front is because I was doing it in order. I was going through, I don't know how many topics I must have covered, how many points, because the thing about the Rogan podcast is that it's not like there was some overarching theme that they stuck on the whole time. It was all over the place. They talked about history, they talked about manuscripts, they talked about the resurrection, they talked about Paul, and it's shifting like every second. It's like moving around. And so you either just leave that, and to be honest, if it were on any other show or anything, maybe I would have left it, because it was so like all over the place that it's hard to pin down. But because this is the first time that the gospel has been comprehensively preached on the biggest podcast in the world, it's due a response. And the only way to do that is to go through each individual claim one by one and see what some of the problems are. And the first of those claims that I found dubious was about the Isaiah scroll. So that's why I started with it. And I spent 2 minutes on it. And it was not that which caused this ruckus. What caused the ruckus is that following me spending the first 2 minutes of my video on the Isaiah scroll, I had responses from you, I had a response from Gavin, we've heard the response from Wes Huff, all making quite long, quite detailed arguments as to why he's still essentially correct. If people had come out and said, okay, he was wrong about that, fair enough, but let's move on to the other topics, then we would have heard the last of it. But instead, people said, no, he was essentially correct, and I'm going to tell you why. And Gavin's video in particular tells me that I was incorrect because it's mostly spelling and because the missing verses show up in other texts. Like, one of which is false and the other of which is only partially true because it shows up in other fragmentary later texts and doesn't even contain the entire missing verses. So that's the reason I've made such a big deal out of this.
Gavin's going to respond to you when Gavin gets around to responding to you. Gavin's out of the country right now. So that's why he hasn't responded to you. I think what this is going to come down to, Alex, is if the question is 95% the same versus 100% the same, is that essentially right or is that essentially wrong? I'm going to take the position, and you might think this is unfair of me. You might think this is technically. I'm going to take the position that in a conversation, not a debate, not an academic paper, in a conversation, he is essentially right. You disagree with that conclusion. Dan McClellan has been generous and said up to 99%. So to me, we're splitting over 1%, and you're saying, well, technically he's wrong, and I'm saying he's essentially right. And it becomes an issue of how do we then deal with that? Is 95%, 99% versus 100%? That there is the discretion. And let me just reiterate, the verdict is still out. They're still working on this, and they're going to compile the data and go dive deep into it and let these textual critics of the Old Testament sort it out. So that's where we land.
So
is that fair?
Where West says of a document which is 93% accurate in my view, 95% in some others, to the Dead Sea, to the Masoretic text, where he says that is word for word identical, you think that he's essentially correct?
I think if Dan McClellan said that he would have been okay with 99%, his mentor said 95%. Okay, I think you're doing a more conservative number. Yes, I think he's essentially correct. I think he's essentially correct. And I think it's okay to say he's essentially correct. It sounds like we're grasping for straws. It sounds like we're fighting and being very nitpicky. I think that's a fair conclusion to have. In light of a 3-hour conversation, the context of the conversation is not a debate. It is not an academic paper. It is not a textbook. It is not it is a conversation just like you and I having, where I'm sure if I watched this back, I probably said something that was, I misspoke. Maybe you said something that misspoke.
Oh, yeah.
It's a different context, right? So that's what I'm saying. In the context of what's happening here, yes, I think that it is okay to say that Wes essentially was correct.
Was he wrong?
Was he wrong between 99% and 100%? Sure, he was wrong.
Was he wrong when he said that it was word for word identical? Was he incorrect?
Again, the verdict is still out. The verdict is
still
out.
It's not out. It's not out on whether it's identical.
Whoa. If you're saying is 99% the same as 100%, and in a technical sense, in a very technical and academic sense, is that wrong? If you want that one, Alex, you can have that. Okay, you could take that, man. You got it, bro.
Because 99% to 100%. 99% number.
No. Dan McClellan's mentor, who you cited, Alex, said 99%, and we played that clip. And then Dan McClellan, you cited Dan. You cited Dan. So Dan's mentor, Peter, said 99% publicly. Dan thinks it's 95%. So again, this is something for them to sort out on what the actual percentage is, and I'm going to let the experts sort that out. So I'm saying in a very technical sense, I think that he was essentially right. If you want the 1%, 5% versus 100%, you could have that one, Alex. Is that fair?
I think that's quite important. And again, not to belabor the point, maybe we should move on, but I think that this does just come down to whether you think that a text, which is 95%, I think the audience gets to decide. 93% identical.
Yeah, I think the audience gets to decide.
That is word for word. So can I ask you a question then, which I asked in my video, which I don't think I've had an answer to yet, although I haven't looked.
Okay, and I got a bunch of questions for you too. So
I bet. For on this point, then, would you extend the same civility and charitability if my hypothetical were to come true? If a Muslim had gone on Joe Rogan and said that they discovered a Quran from 1,000 years ago, which was word for word identical with the Quran that they had today. Now, I know why you're smiling, because you want to talk about the preservation of the Quran and the Uthmanic Codex and all this kind of stuff, which, by the way...
Okay, you made it to that part in the video.
I think basically, like, I hate to say it, I think it basically all just, like, was missed. I don't think you understood the point of what I was trying to say, because none of that actually changes any of this. Okay. The point is, like, it doesn't, let's suppose that this person is completely incorrect. It doesn't matter if they're right, it doesn't matter if they're wrong. What I'm saying is, just imagine somebody made this claim, a Muslim made this claim, that they had a 1,000-year-old Quran that was word for word identical, and this really impressed Joe Rogan. And then it transpired that there were, in fact, separate to all of the orthographic variants, thousands of textual variants, including actual missing verses altogether. And this Muslim had gone on Rogan, and Rogan was repeating this claim, saying, like, man, like, I'm reconsidering this Quran because I didn't know that, like, this one text they found was identical. It's been keeping me up at night. And it turned out that there were actually thousands of textual variants and missing verses altogether. Would you not respond to that Muslim's appearance on Joe Rogan and say, that is incorrect, he got it wrong, and he's making Islam seem more trustworthy than it actually is? Or would you say, hey, everyone, give him some grace because he was basically correct. The Quran is word for word identical with that old text.
Sure.
What would you do?
So, one, I wouldn't care. Okay. Two, I would cite Bart Ehrman, who said that just because something is an infallible text doesn't make it true. Okay. So one, I wouldn't care. Two, I would just cite Bart Ehrman and say, well, just because something is infallible doesn't make it true. Three, I would say, hey, can we talk about the preservation of the Quran? Can we talk about Uthman burning all these copies? Can we talk about the variants that are still out? And I would probably point to that, but I wouldn't sit here and nitpick and be upset about it. I personally wouldn't. I'm not speaking on behalf of all Christian YouTubers. I'm not speaking on behalf of other Christian apologetics channels. I'm saying personally, I probably wouldn't jump out the window and make a video about it. Personally.
You wouldn't make a video if a Muslim went on the biggest podcast in the world and made a false claim which increased Joe Rogan's credence in Islam. You wouldn't care about that.
I don't make videos about Islam, Alex. You know that, right?
The algorithm hates
we don't. Yeah, bro. We don't. We don't talk about Islam. You don't talk about Islam. We don't really talk about Islam.
That's different then. Like, okay, if you just don't talk about it anyway.
Well, I would say from an actual execution standpoint, Joe Rogan has has talked about a lot of insane theories around the Bible
all the time.
And stuff. And so sometimes we'll cover the ones about the Bible. But he's had Buddhists on. He's had a lot of different people that have talked about some really crazy ideas that have stuck with Joe Rogan that don't have significance to us. So I would believe Ruslan here. Maybe I'm a little biased. I'm sitting in the same room.
That may be true.
Zach would have trouble creating a creative thumbnail for it as well. So
yeah.
How do we package this, Ruslan?
I don't know what you personally would do, but suppose that your Christian colleagues like Daily Dose of Wisdom and all of these kind of channels came out and said a Muslim went on Joe Rogan for the first time and preached the Quran, and he made this false claim, and Joe Rogan was really impressed, but it was actually wrong, and this was like totally, and it became like a big sort of scandal, and everyone was talking about it.
Yeah.
Would you come to the defense of the Muslim? Would you say like, actually, no, I think the Christians are kind of nitpicking, and this is unimportant because like the Muslim was essentially correct. Like when he said that that this imaginary Quran was word for word identical, he was basically correct. Like I don't think that everyone would be so charitable here.
Maybe you're right. I like the scenario that you're painting, and I honestly don't know how this scenario will play out. I'll be completely honest with you, Alex. I have friends that do Muslim apologetics, God Logic apologetics, David Wood, who you're going to debate in a couple weeks here, and I don't generally keep up with their content. I don't know the ins and outs. I don't, and sometimes, and I've had David Wood on, and I've talked about, hey man, sometimes you're explaining why you're kind of harsh, and sometimes you seem to be kind of mean to these folks, and he's talked about it. So I'm just giving you like my genuinely honest answer. I don't know, because it's an interesting scenario you're painting. That doesn't mean I keep up with everything, and I don't even know if I would be keeping up with this entire Islam debacle thing. I'm trying to answer you as straightforward as possible.
Yeah, I think there's a slight. Okay, so I think there's a slight difference, and this is my perspective. I think there might be a slight difference with the Islam versus the Christianity because of the cultural and worldwide significance of Christianity having already impacted culture so much so that Joe Rogan would already be at a point where he's like, man, it feels so significant to culture, to the entire world, to time itself. And I believe it to be true when acted out over a long enough period of time that this is a net positive for people. My only hang up is that it's just oral tradition, and it's probably not even believable. And it's just so many, and this is what he said for years. There's just so many copies and so many errors and so many, there's no way that this is actually real. So that when the conversation of a textual accuracy comes up, and we can actually kind of start exploring that, and that came up with the West Huff, Isaiah Scrolls, that it wouldn't for the Quran being, let's say the Quran has the same situation, right? And they go, wow, that's amazing. I don't think that there's the cultural significance and the rapport that built up with Islam to actually make that significant enough for Joe Rogan. Yet, because of the cultural significance of Christianity, and again, and
we've been tracking the Rogan thing, Alex, for years. We've been calling this for years and years and years out. So it's a moment for us, like as Christian YouTubers, as it's a moment for us. We're like, man, this is awesome. Like we've been saying this for years about Joe Rogan seemingly shifting towards what we call a biblical worldview or Christian worldview, and then it sounds like, man, it's clearly happening to a various degree.
I think the Bible. That's pretty awesome. I think the Bible having having a copy that has a lot of accuracies does more to tip the scales for people that were just on the edge about that than the Quran does to tip the edge for people into Islam. That's kind of my point. That's kind of a separate point. It's a little more cultural. But
I would dispute that for a few reasons, by the way. The most important being that, of course, these are two fundamentally different kinds of texts. I mean, the Quran, Quran. You know what Quran means?
Do I know what the Quran means?
I thought I always meant
as in like the word Quran.
I don't. You could refresh me. Okay, this is not something I talk about, Alex.
So I'm hearing. No, I'm sorry. It sounds like I'm trying to test yourself. I just heard two voices. I got a bit lost in my train of thought. What I mean to say is that the Quran, the word Quran means recitation. So the idea is that this text or these words are the literal, like, recited words of Muhammad that he was hearing from God, which is different from the Bible. Because say what you like about it being God breathed, which is about the closest you get to the idea of it being inspired in Scripture. It's not the same kind of text. It's written by men, and Muslims believe that the Quran is co-eternal with God. So I agree with you that it's different for that reason. But I think it would be more significant for that reason if the exact words of the Quran had been preserved. Of course, this is the case in neither of those texts. But the idea that you said, I wanted to ask, you said this is a big moment for us. It seems like Joe Rogan is sort of moving towards this. Yeah. Was there something in particular from the Wes Huff interview that made you think, Joe Rogan is receptive to this? Like, what made you think that from the Wes Huff interview?
I'll be honest with you, and I can't say too much. I probably shouldn't say too much about it publicly, Alex, and I can share privately if you want me to. But there's private stuff that's happening. There's appearances he's making. Let me just say it that way. That people are reaching out and sharing, and that certain places he's popping up in that would seem to confer what we've been documenting publicly, that it's happening privately. And then the Wes Huff situation is just kind of the cherry on top. Does that make sense? I don't want to.
That's fine, but I wonder what it is about. The reason I ask, by the way, is just because with the public stuff, where you say it's the cherry on top, this is like, you know, an outward sign that Joe Rogan is moving towards Christianity.
Hopefully, God willing, yes.
Is there something in the podcast, in the public-facing bit, that made you think that might be the case?
Oh, yeah. I would say the past, 3 years of content and just his complete shift towards being much more friendlier to Christianity in general, much more friendlier to Christian guests, much more friendlier to the Christian worldview, consistently rejecting the atheist worldview, the naturalist worldview. Yeah, I would say there's been a lot of stuff that he said publicly. I can't give you quotes off the top of my head,
The reason I was asking was because if it was something specific, it's just earlier you were saying, for example, that bringing up the word-for-word identity is essentially nitpicking because it's one thing in a 3-hour podcast. But if there was something in the podcast, like if you'd have just said to me, like, well, when he seemed so amazed about Isaiah, then I might have pointed out that means it is actually quite significant and worth picking out of the podcast. So I wondered if there were things that you thought
there was other stuff. I think he
seemed. I think one of the most significant parts was and we talked about this a lot too, was regardless of Joe Rogan's faith journey, is that as Christians having, especially at the end of the podcast when Wes goes over the Sermon on the Mount, and so we have a real scholar, a real like biblical scholar, finally on Joe Rogan, not just kind of like an actor who's also Christian, you know, a Hulk Hogan or whatever, talking about the Bible, but then also presenting the gospel, presenting the gospel through the Sermon on the Mount at the very end of the podcast. I think that's very significant. Is that like, oh, there's someone like really communicating the gospel from an intellectual standpoint and the theological standpoint at the end. And I thought that was significant.
When you say biblical scholar, what counts as a biblical scholar?
Oh, as a regular guy wearing a Dickies jacket, I would say the guy that studies the Bible full time and gets paid to do so.
So
like you consider PhD students to be counted among the like?
Yeah, but he's working on his PhD. Class. I mean, I don't want to get into again. I don't want to get into nitpicking Wes Huff's credentials here, but yes,
I don't mind this either. But also, it's not me who likes to bring that up. It's in all of my comment sections where people say that I'm some guy who doesn't know what he's talking about and he's an expert.
Alex, I've never said that about you. So I don't know.
I know you're not. I know you're not saying that.
I've only said positive things about you. I think you went to Oxford. You're probably way smarter than I am. Your IQ is way smarter than, way higher than mine. So, Alex, I'm not saying that you are not an expert.
And we definitely don't co-sign the comment section.
Yeah, we do not co-sign the
comment section is crazy. I've already banned a few people in this thing that have said crazy things out of pocket.
Yes.
And so we can't co-sign the comment.
Yeah.
You know, people.
I think someone could be an expert.
For example, I think that Kip Davis is. It's not just like Kip Davis is another biblical scholar, because you've said a few times, like Dan McClellan, who's not a scholar of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, so the Old Testament textual critic about Dan McClellan.
I brought him on the show. I brought him on the show because he'd been talking publicly about it, and that was why. And he communicates quite well. Kip Davis is not just like another biblical scholar. He's a leading expert in the field, and so I think that like where Kip Davis is in disagreement with Wes Huff, a PhD student in a different field, that is New Testament manuscript analysis and paratextual features in particular, like I'm going to like prima facie trust Kip Davis's interpretation more than, and he has been a little bit more unforgiving in the interpretation of Wes's statements on Joe Rogan.
Let me be super transparent with you. I have no idea who Kip Davis is outside of him being on your channel. I've never heard of this gentleman before. I thought the get off my lawn thing was honestly pretty funny, and he could be super smart. I think I'm just gonna defer to. I don't want to be disparaging to Kip. So all props to you, Kip. Okay. I'm going to let them sort it out, because even West and Kip's conversation and other people who've talked to Kip, I think we should let them sort it out in terms of it's just, I think that's going to be the most charitable thing. Here's another update. Okay. And I feel weird even doing this.
Is West okay with that?
Yes, you can also tell him. So you can also tell him, Alex, you can also tell him, this is from Wes, that Joe Rogan and this is Wes. Myth Vision, pay attention, my brother. I love Derek, by the way, from Myth Vision. I love it. No, Derek's my guy. Derek's coming on his channel. Derek's coming on his channel. I love Derek.
I love the atheists. I love the Orthodox.
I love everybody.
I'm the guy that has to make bridges for Ruslan here. Holy
I love
smokes.
everybody. So this is what Wes said to me. Mm-hmm. You can tell him that Joe Rogan and I have talked about this, and he didn't seem to care whether it was 90% or word for word, that Joe still seemed to think that was a miracle.
I obviously haven't heard that before. I would like to know when that message was sent, because Joe Rogan did repeat the claim.
Okay, but he still thinks it's a miracle, whether it's 90%,
93%. I think Wes probably felt bad.
I don't know exactly what it is that Wes will have said to Joe Rogan, but if it was before Joe Rogan,
okay, I'm gonna get you a screen grab. Can I get you? You want me to get you a screen grab of what he said? Yes, you want me to get you a screen grab of whatever he said?
All right, here's my guess: is that Wes honestly felt. My guess is that Wes honestly felt bad, especially after creating this big ruckus.
And he cleaned up his mess. You should be thankful for that.
It was like, dag, maybe I really got Joe Rogan on the edge here, thinking that it was a miracle. So let me follow up. So it sounds like he did follow up with them and then clear up. And then Joe Rogan was like, yeah, potato.
Which is how Alex, which is how the rest of us are hearing this, my brother.
And Alex, I will say, I do understand your point. I don't think your point is not valid. Like I do think there's probably a sect of the population for sure that is listening to that, and that would make a huge difference. And they're probably people that think very similar to you and people in your circles. Like there is an archetype of a person for sure that is really important. And I don't think you're wrong for that.
Yeah, we're not saying you're a bad guy.
I'm not tripping about that. Like I totally get you. Like, and I get how, like, I wouldn't say miracle. I would just say really good love and care for the scriptures and practices over lots of generations. Yeah. If it actually was word for word, I would be like, wow, that's a miracle. If it's 90%, I'd be like, wow, what great care for scripture.
Sure.
But I would, so in that sense, I totally agree that like miracle was a bit of a stretch and can be misleading to a certain sect of the population. It sounds like Wes Huff couldn't go back on the Joe Rogan podcast and clear that up, yet went back to Joe Rogan himself and hopefully, from what it sounds like, cleared it up. And
I mean,
and it wasn't if it's the Joe
you got to
Rogan.
admit that's very commendable, right, Alex? That Wes goes to Joe in light of all this, cleans it up, and if Joe goes on repeating it, and again, conversation 90%, 94%, 99%, you got to admit that that's pretty commendable, and that he did everything he could to clear this up. And that's something that, man, like, that's awesome. Even though I still think he was essentially correct. And Joe Rogan thinks he was essentially correct. I think that's awesome.
I don't know if he did everything that he could to clear it up. I think that he, for a start, could have just flatly admitted that he was wrong in the response video that he made, and also not then misquoted Gleason Archer again. But I want to be clear here. Like Wes seems like a cool dude, man. Like I like Wes. I've got nothing against the guy. And I hope he's well, etc. The problem is that, like, he's sort of acting as if this has all just been cleared up. You will recall in Wes's response video that he made, and this is the public response video that he made, because he said something to Rogan. I would be interested to see what Rogan's actual words were in response there, because if Joe Rogan still says, like, with the same level of enthusiasm, like, wow, this is kind of keeping me up at night, this is amazing, that there's like a 90-something% fidelity, which is fairly standard, I would actually be surprised, and I would have to take a step back on that point. But I think it would depend, because if Rogan says something to the effect of, like, oh, okay, never mind, that's still pretty cool though, then Sure.
Okay.
But if he says I'm still amazed, then I would be quite surprised.
Okay. Fair enough.
The problem with the response that I see has a lot to do with this conflation of 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B. Now we can talk about that, but I'm going to have to go and grab my laptop charger because
can you grab your charger? I gotta use the restroom, and we're going to play a quick commercial break. You grab your charger, and then we'll jump back in. Is that fair? We're going to play some cringy commercials.
Like a wooden rosary or something that you're selling.
Yes. Yes, exactly, Alex.
I wish.
Okay. We're going to sell our Bless God Summit. Here we go. I'm excited to bring you guys our very first 3-day conference called the Bless God Summit, happening March 27th, 28th, 29th in Southern California. And at this conference, we'll have your very own Preston Perry.
Me, as an evangelist, I've made it up in my mind that I'm not going to leave people with an excuse not to serve Jesus.
Dr. Sean McDowell.
If there's one thing Christians should care about, it's truth.
Our vision with this conference is to equip, empower, and inspire people to do the work of the ministry that God has for them in this time. And at this conference, we'll have your very own Alan Parr and his wife, Jim Parr.
It's the #1 reason, people want to get divorced because they want to find someone else who can make them happy. Now, what they don't realize, they're chasing the wind.
John McCrae from What Do You Mean?
What you may be shocked, or you may not be shocked to know, is that the majority of Christians in America, they don't know how to articulate the message of the gospel to non-believers.
Lila Rose.
Love and marriage go together, that sex and marriage go together, that sex can bring life into the world, and that's an amazing thing, that's not a bad thing.
Trizzle Fitness.
Most people fail at dieting because they're just trying to lose weight too fast. What are you in such a rush for?
But where a lot of people get stuck is figuring out what it looks like to walk in that. And so these 3 pillars of our conference will be covering everything from apologetics to family in the home and the marketplace, and how you can lean into those 3 pillars to discover your calling on this side of eternity. How old are you turning, Alex? I don't know much about you. You're in your early 30s now?
I'll be 26.
Gosh darn it, this freaking guy. Yeah, man. All right. I thought you were 20, at least 30. Man, you're smart, dude. Okay.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
I really mean that as a compliment. You're very sharp. So, yeah, you're young. My goodness.
I think you're at least 32. For what it's worth.
Aww. Aww, so sweet. I'm 40, man. I just turned 40. So you're way younger than me and way smarter than me. Okay. Gosh, I didn't know you were 26. My goodness. Okay. So where were we in this kind? Because I have so many questions for you, and I feel like you're asking really, really great questions.
You're turning 26, and I'm still what do they call it, a quarter centurion or whatever. Yeah. We were gonna. There's a lot to say about the Isaiah scroll. I don't know how much we want to belabor that point, but for example, do you at least the portion talking about the Isaiah scroll here? You made a video with Gavin Ortland's response, and I think in my most recent video I quite comprehensively showed why on that section it just didn't work on various levels. Do you agree that response just doesn't hold up?
Yeah, I'm gonna let Gavin respond to you, but from the looks of it, if he omitted quotes the way you describe he did, if there was I don't remember all the arguments. Forgive me. We make a lot of videos and there's a lot of information we're processing real time. So I don't remember everything. I'm not a Gavin Ortland apologist, though I consider him a friend and he's going to be at our conference. But I'll let Gavin respond to you when he's back in the country.
I like him
he
too.
Did say he was going to respond to you.
It was unfortunate that this false claim about orthography in particular showed up on some quite big channels. But also the other point was about this missing verse. In fact, one of the most popular comments on my original video with thousands of likes said, look, I checked, and it turns out that these missing verses are found in other texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as if everybody didn't realize, which I wouldn't have realized at the time, and I don't think these people realize either, that those texts are later than the Isaiah scroll. And
the manuscripts are later than the Isaiah scroll. Is that what you mean? Okay.
So the missing verse that we were talking about, which is chapter 2, part of verse 9 and verse 10, show up in 2 other places, which are manuscripts called 4Q Isaiah A and 4Q Isaiah B. And people
that came after those.
Yes, and people said, look, these verses were missing, and I think you talked about that with someone as well. Like it might have been Dan. I can't remember. Saying that these verses show up elsewhere. They show up in those 2 other documents, which was sort of used to do away with the problem. That was like the response, because remember that it was like they're mostly spelling. No, they're not. Okay, well, if they're not mostly spelling, aren't they all insignificant? And this was the example I give in the video of a more significant variant. And
missing verses being more significant. Yes.
With this reference to 4Q Isaiah A and 4Q Isaiah B, which those verses are in those texts, but they still contain variants to the Masoretic text and also are incomplete and also are later. So that was the other part of Gavin's video, which is why it was a shame to see it being shared in that way. But you know, I don't know. It's not exactly, you know, on you to vet everything in that level of detail. But that's one of the reasons why I thought let's come on the show. That's one of the reasons I mentioned you in my video, because this claim was making it around.
Yeah. Again, I'll let Gavin respond to you when he responds to you. I know there are. If I had to steelman his position very quickly, I think I understand the logic that if verses show up in other manuscripts, it's possible that the manuscripts they're missing from lost the verses, and therefore perhaps there's earlier manuscripts that may have had them, and there's a gap, right? So if I had to steelman,
it's worth pointing out that that there are other reasons to think that verse is later, other than just this particular manuscript evidence. There are also, this was unfortunate actually, because the thing that got lost in all of this, in like the debating, is just how interesting it all is, how interesting the Isaiah scroll is. And there are some significant aspects of the Isaiah scroll which I don't think are strong enough to include in essentially a polemical video, like defending my reputation against a swath of negative comments. But some really interesting things about the Isaiah scroll, which tells us that it might have had a different understanding of Isaiah than the Masoretic text. For example, there is some evidence to suggest, some quite good evidence to suggest, that the author of the Isaiah scroll had actually written down two texts that have both been since sort of put together into the one text of Isaiah. It's well known that there are thought to be 2 or maybe 3 Isaiahs. That was already thought before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there's a really interesting paratextual feature of the Dead Sea of the Isaiah scroll, which is at the end of. I could show you actually if you pull it up on screen. I don't know if you can do that. It's really interesting. But maybe you also just want to move on.
I'd rather move on, and this is why this is insignificant to me, Alex. And I don't mean to like give you like a macro picture. It's because I've heard, and maybe you're familiar with some of this, but I've seen this debate between like the KJV only people and them having certain verses, and then the later manuscripts having verses that weren't there, and so. Again, the woman caught in the act of adultery, Mark China. So to me, I've heard this debated, and I personally don't find it significant if there's verses missing.
In this case, it's not a missing verse. In this case, what it is, I'll tell you quickly. If we're not going to show it on screen, people can look it up themselves. If you go onto the digital Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see the Isaiah scroll. You can look at it yourself and scroll through. And if you go to the end of verse 30 of chapter 33, you'll notice something kind of interesting about it, which is that there's a gap. There's about a 3-line gap at the bottom of the page before it continues on the next page with chapter 34. Now, again, this is not my area of expertise, partly because I don't have an area of expertise. But I'm informed by Kip Davis, who, as I say, is the man on this, that everywhere else this occurs in ancient manuscripts, including biblical manuscripts, like every other time, it is an indication of the end of one text and the beginning of the next. So, for example, in the Minor Prophets, we see the Minor Prophets being separated by these line spaces. And now, if you look at our modern text, we separate them out into individual texts because that's what that notation meant. In the Isaiah scroll, we have a 3-line gap at the end of chapter 33 and the beginning of chapter 34, which in Kip Davis's interpretation is an indication that this author thought that they were 2 texts, which given the pre-existing...
Like Isaiah 1, like first Isaiah, second Isaiah? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, like a kind of, like 2 different texts, whether they were written by the same person, whether they were not, whatever, just this paratextual feature, what it shows is that they were at least thought to be 2 separated texts for whatever reason. And like I say, given the already like haunting of Isaiah by this... thought that there are multiple authors behind Isaiah. This extra paratextual feature is really interesting.
Okay, I think Zach found it, but I
can show you where to find it if you like. It's quite easy to find, but people can just look it up themselves. But for example, I just wanted to flag that there are things like that which I think are interesting, and somebody might make a response video to this. They might say, Alex said that the Isaiah scroll is 2 texts. Like, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's a really interesting piece of evidence here that I think needs more explanation, more exploration, which is like really exciting. And I think that that does actually indicate that maybe the Isaiah scroll was interpreting the text differently to how we interpret it today. But that's like a debate. Like, I'm not going to put that forward as some point that debunks Isaiah or Christianity. I just think there's so many interesting facets of this conversation that are being missed through this debate.
Listen, we could talk about so many different interesting things, Alex. I've talked to Jewish people who feel like Isaiah was corrupted by later Christian scribes and then inserted with all the suffering passages of the suffering servant and all the messianic passages. I've heard a lot of interesting stuff about this, and that's stuff that I just genuinely am like, oh man, that sounds interesting. I want to go explore that. Was there any evidence for that, right? So I'm sure there's all sorts of fascinating things that we could talk about with regarding this. And I'm sure people will. Maybe somebody will look that up and make sense of it. And that's not to disparage, Kip Davis or anyone whose area of expertise is that.
I would recommend that people watch the 3-hour live stream that Kip Davis did if they're interested, because he sort of covers all of this in detail and does all the stuff that we're incapable of talking about, but also don't have the time to talk about. It's incredibly fascinating as a document.
Fair enough. Okay, so
but I think that shows that the person who's writing all of the suffering servant related stuff might be different from the prophet Isaiah, who writes the first part of Isaiah that everyone, exactly.
Or
I think that's an interesting.
Maybe it's a different scribe. Maybe Isaiah's, because I know there's books in the New Testament where Paul is writing by hand, and then there's other times where someone is transcribing for him. So maybe it implies
somebody else is writing Paul's letters all together and falsely attributing to them to Paul. All the ways.
You get into Hebrews, and if that's so. Anyway, I think that's a
First and Second Timothy and Titus were the ones that came to mind.
Yeah, so I would say I think Paul was still involved in the process somehow, but that's neither here nor there. So can we move on? Ask you a couple other questions.
Definitely one of those. It's definitely here or there, but it might not be both. So yeah, sure. What have you got?
Okay, so can we come back to this idea of Islam? Now, this has been in the comments, and I'm just genuinely curious. I've seen you describe yourself as a non-combative non-believer and still engage with Christianity. Some people would say this last engagement, up to personal opinion on if this was nitpicky or not. But is it true, and have you ever stated this publicly, that the reason you don't go hard or you don't engage with Islam, or you haven't, again, I'm just reading this in the comments, so I'm genuinely asking, is that at some point you were afraid for your life with regards to criticizing Islam? Is there any truth to that, any validity to that, or is that totally non sequitur and irrelevant?
I think that's not the reason. I think this is unfortunate. I was doing a debate with Cliff and Stuart Connectley, and it came up in the Q&A, and the questioner asked why you don't talk about it and mentioned something about the safety. And so I said, well, yeah, of course, there is just the fact that it is less safe to do so. I can't remember the words that I said. And then I said that basically this is just not like my area. Like I say, I'm not an expert in anything, but New Testament is kind of like my thing. Like that's my jam. That's what I'm interested in. And that's what I kind of know about. And so the problem is that if I were to make a video about the Quran, you would probably celebrate this, right? Like if I made a video about the Quran talking about how it has not been perfectly preserved.
No, I think if you blasted Islam as a net negative worldview, I would probably be pumped that you did that.
Be like, awesome. But the problem is that, can you imagine the kind of response that this Isaiah scroll stuff has had? When I think I'm actually right about this, imagine if I was just actually flatly wrong, which is very likely to happen if I try to do a similar kind of project when it comes to Islam. Now, for the record, of course, I have debated Islam before, and I have spoken about Islam before. In the years since then, I have specialized in the New Testament, even at the expense of philosophy of religion. You might notice that I haven't really been doing much in the way of like arguments for God's existence. Haven't said the word kalam in like 5 years, because it sort of fell out of focus as I began to realize that what I'm interested in, and therefore now what I probably know the most about, relevant to the discussions I can have online, is the New Testament. Unfortunately, that just means that I'm not very well equipped to talk about Islam. But I mean, of course, like it is dangerous, and you do receive death threats and all of this kind of stuff. Like, I mean, there is that. But
and
also,
did you receive death threats? Like I saw you had a debate from several years ago from Muhammad Hijab, and I think I saw a reaction of yours. Was there death threats? And was there like
It's a question that's not sensible to ask and not sensible to answer, because however you answer it, it encourages people to try. But I think people are referring there to a particular exchange that I had with Muhammad Hijab, in which he made some videos which some people have interpreted as him trying to issue some kind of threat. But I don't have any comment on that because people can go and decide that for themselves.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, so do you view Christianity as a net positive for the world?
I'm agnostic on that question because, of course, there are so many competing ideas here. One is like you think about the way that the meaning crisis has been connected to atheism and how atheism at least requires the falsity of Christianity. So maybe if Christianity were true, that would resolve that problem fine. You also think about how wars and conflicts can be exacerbated by religious fervor if they're not already caused by them. I think that the best survey on the history of wars in the world has concluded that about 7% of them are like religiously motivated. So a small minority, but those which are, I like to sort of ask whether you think that the ones which are not would be made better or worse by the introduction of severe religious fervor. So it kind of depends on when you're talking about throughout history, right? Because there are times when I think Christianity has been a negative force and times when I think it's been net positive. Right now it's hard to say because it doesn't seem to have quite the cultural power that it once had. It does seem to be regaining that to some degree in some circles. So I guess we'll see when we get there. But I am also not a sociologist or an anthropologist, so it's difficult for me to say. But if you just want a hunch, like, I don't know, man.
Okay. In terms of, a Tom Holland in Dominion, in terms of what Jordan Peterson's been talking about, you don't see those as legitimate arguments for why Christianity has been generally a net pod. They're arguments, which I agree with, by the way, but they're arguments. And Tom Holland, I want to say, is an agnostic. You're probably closer to it. He's over the pond, right? But he goes to church and he practices the faith. There's been articles
Apparently
also written about
I think
this.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
he's also spoken publicly about the healing of. I think he had something. I might be making this up, but he might have had like a cancer scare or something, and something about the way that he received the news that all was clear. He at least implied that he had interpreted slightly religiously. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the next year or two there's an article in Unheard called, once a cultural Christian. Dropping the cultural, whatever.
So would you reject his arguments? Would you say, nah, I don't think he makes a compelling case in Dominion, or the gentleman that Glenn, he's affiliated with West Huff.
Scrivener.
I think, yes, he's great too. He kind of wrote like a dummies version, the Dominion for Dummies type version. I forget his book, but it was great. So would you just
he also wrote the Christian version, right? Because he's actually a Christian. But I think that the argument that you can separate out 2 points here, because the big thesis of these texts is that Western civilization is built upon like essentially uniquely Christian values. Another question is whether Christianity has been a good force in the world, right? Okay. Which do need to be separated. I think that the idea that like the values that are being ascribed by people like Holland to being a result of Christianity have probably broadly been good for the world, but the dispute that I have is the idea that these are uniquely Christian. These are uniquely Christian traits. The idea that the abolition of slavery was not just like happened to be done by religious people, because basically everyone was religious at the time, but like is actually the natural interpretive like reading of Christianity, and that's kind of what Christianity is getting at all along. And this is an expression of that value. Things like individualism, Western civilization, some of its defining qualities might be things like capitalism, individualism, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of sexual partner, this kind of stuff. At least in the modern West, none of these, I think, are supported by Christian doctrine, and in fact, I think most of them run anathema to it. So,
really,
I'm
none
highly
of them?
suspicious.
None of
them? I can't remember everyone that I just listed. So perhaps you can tell me what you've got a qualm with.
Okay, what about do unto others as you'd have them do unto you? Love your neighbor as yourself. The idea that it's not just pragmatic actions that matter, but it's also your heart. If you've heard it said, don't kill. I tell you, if you hate your brother, you've committed murder. Like, you don't think any of that has impacted and shaped wildly the Western civilization?
Depending on which exact quotes you're honing in on there, I don't know if they're as revolutionary or unique to Christianity as people would like to say. Christianity might be the way that some people have like first heard of some ideas. It may be, I think the most unique like Christian ethical principles are loving your enemy. I think that's genuinely quite a radical idea.
How about
like the
how about
idea
charity?
Charity, hard to say. Again, I'm not a historian, so
caring
I
for
don't
people
know.
who can't care for themselves. Okay, that was one of the ones that
I don't think that itself.
Bart Ehrman conceded that was one of the one from Glenn's book that he said he could draw a through line and connect that value to Christianity, Christians caring for people who are of less power.
So this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because the idea is, and like I say, I don't know about this, but let's grant it. Let's say that this idea of caring for the downtrodden and the disadvantaged is a Christian idea. The problem is that the apparent expression of this ostensibly Christian ethic is flatly non-Christian results. So people like to say, this is why you get this weird contradictory statement that like the LGBT rights movement is essentially Christian because it cares about it's a care for the downtrodden, for people who are oppressed in society, blah blah blah, and so essentially this is kind of an expression of a Christian principle, sure, but doing so in such a way that is flatly contradictory to Christian teaching. And I think the same thing happens in a lot of these areas where you might say that like caring for people is Christian. As I say, I'm sort of dubious to that assertion, but let's say it were true. How is it expressing itself in the modern West? In ways that run counter to Christian scripture. So when people say that Western civilization is based upon Christian values, I don't think they can be talking about the text. They're certainly not talking about the Hebrew Bible. That can't be the case.
I mean, I don't want to get into the can of worms about the Hebrew Bible. I would say generally the teachings of Jesus seem to imply a net positive from how most people would view them, and they have impacted society for the better. I don't think that's a wild thing for you to concede as a atheist agnostic or where you currently
of course
land.
not. So I think that if you are like a red letter Christian and you just take the words of Jesus, particularly if you are willing to be a bit more selective than the Christian in interpreting which of those are accurate and which are not, I think you'll end up being a pretty good person. Yeah, like I very often, to use the atheist cliche, like do think, what would Jesus do? Because he's obviously onto something morally there, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that this text is appended to a much bigger, much more specific, much more legalistic text, which has specific instructions regarding things like the ownership of and selling of other human beings as private property. And when people say that the abolitionist movement is essentially Christian in origin, I like to imagine going back in time onto a plantation and telling the master of the plantation that what he's doing is wrong and he should let those people go, and ask where is the first place he would turn, and plausibly so, in order to show me that what he's doing is actually perfectly permissible. Now, you may say that there are verses in the Bible about kidnapping. There are verses in the Bible that seem to designate the trading of slaves as something that should be prohibited. This is fine, but at best, what that shows is that you're dealing with a contradictory set of doctrines. And so famously, not just the same text, but the same verses are being used on both sides of the debate. So at best, I think you show that you've got a malleable text that can be put to essentially whatever cause the religious person wants it to be. And that's the point the atheist makes, is like, sure, you can be an abolitionist Christian, but you can also be a Christian slaveholder and do it with just as much. Of course, antebellum American South slavery, the treatment of slaves there, is a totally different kettle of fish to Old Testament slavery. So
yes,
I don't think.
Thank you for conceding that, by the way, because I think Dan, I couldn't get
that's
Dan
really important.
That's very important. Now I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, and again, not to say Scripture hasn't been weaponized. I think that it would be disingenuous to try and detangle the abolitionist movement from their Christian worldview. I think that's fairly documented, even to the likes of I want to say Jonathan Edwards owned slaves, but then his son was a huge abolitionist, and so they sorted that out internally. But I would say something as simple as do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I would say that's a clear admonishment and saying, no, you can't do unto others as you'd have them do unto you if you're carrying slaves. I would say the fact that slaves were intentionally kept away from missionaries because they might learn and read the Bible and all of a sudden not, want their freedom. I think there's enough there, but we don't have to belabor that point.
I think it's important to point out that the Old Testament is quite clear in the permissibility of the ownership of other human beings as private property. And even in the New Testament, Jesus seems at one point, interestingly, to at least implicitly accept the existence of slavery. In one of his examples, it's not quite a parable, he sort of says to his disciples, which of you, when a sometimes translated as servant, but when a slave comes to you and says something like, can I eat my food, would not first say, go and do your work and then come back, basically implicitly accepting the existence of this practice. Now, people can say if they like that if you did Christian slavery properly, you'd end up with a much better and more humane form of slavery.
Yeah, a bond servant model of slavery.
The idea that you can read the Bible, the idea that you can read the Bible and from it ascertain that what God really wants is the abolition of the idea of human beings as private property, I think would have to be an intentional misleading, because it is just so clear that that's not the case. Your male and female slaves may come from the nations around you. From them, you may buy and sell slaves. You may also purchase temporary residents living among you, and they can become your property, and you can bequeath these to your children as inheritable property.
Yeah,
but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites.
You don't see progressive revelation as a thing in Scripture, meaning you have God allowing certain parameters within certain practices, and then as the Scriptures progress, you see Ephesians 6, making everyone equal, no slave, no Greek, no Jew. Like you don't see. I'm just genuinely asking. You don't see a progress, meaning that Jesus tells them, hey, like God permitted divorce because of your wicked hearts.
Yes.
We see polygamy permitted, but that wasn't the intentional original design in Genesis 1, right? So we see God working within certain institutions that were not his design, but him creating parameters. And then as things progress, it becomes, I would say a pretty clear abolitionist teaching from my vantage point. Do you not concede that there's progression happening and God working within systems that are flawed and then establishing better ways to do things?
I think not. And I'll tell you why.
Fair enough.
Because for a start, there is this idea that in the Hebrew Bible, God sort of allows slavery. He kind of wanted to get rid of it secretly all along, but kind of couldn't do it for whatever reason. And he's sort of trying to make things better for people. Okay, here's one example. In the book of Exodus, we're told that a male slave is to go free, and a particular type of slave is to go free, a Hebrew slave, that is, because this is the other thing. Hebrew slaves are treated differently to non-Hebrew slaves.
Yes, and Dan drove that point to me very clear in our conversation.
This is really, that's a really important thing to point out, because oftentimes people say, well, look, it's like Hebrew slaves go free after 7 years. Yeah, Hebrew slaves do. But the ones that you get from the nations around you are bequeathed to your children as inheritable property. Now, the idea that God would not give you the full facts or not pull humanity to where he wants it to be because he can't yet is fine. But to say that he would actually utter a falsehood, I think runs anathema to the Christian idea. Although some people think that God does lie in the Old Testament, that's fine too. But if God were to say this person is your property and endorse that proactively, it's not just like not fully abolishing it, but quite clearly saying that these people are property. I don't think that is I think that that's something that God is proactively saying, and so therefore must have been at least true at that point, right? So it's not like he secretly thought they couldn't be property because humans are all intrinsically valuable, created equal, blah blah blah, because he said that they were properties. That must be true at the time. But besides that's that. But the important thing here is that in Exodus it says that a male slave is to go free after 7 years. If he has
Hebrew slaves,
female slaves aren't the same, by the way. But if he takes a wife and has kids while he's a slave, then the man is to go free, but the wife and the children are not. So if the man wants to stay with his wife and his children, he gets taken outside, his ear gets pierced like cattle, and then he's allowed to live with his wife and children. Now, I would say it wouldn't be too much, I think, for God to say, how about when the Hebrew slave goes free, he let his wife and kids go as well? That would not be some like earth-shattering like problem for people any more than these supposed regulations are already going to be. And so the idea that God is doing his best to overcome, the worst of slavery and move people in the right direction, I just don't think can be true because of verses like that.
And you don't see there's any context in terms of them being slaves in Egypt, and God's constantly reminding them, you were slaves in Egypt, therefore treat the alien, treat the outsider well. Again, Scripture has to interpret Scripture for me. So when I'm looking at what you're saying, I'm looking at it in the context of the greater narrative of Scripture. Then I'm looking at it in the context of the New Testament, and that. So I'm not saying verses cancel verses out, but that's how I'm approaching it, right? I'm approaching it in the context of the grand.
They
narrative.
don't cancel each other out. So what are you saying?
Oh, I'm saying they help if anyone's looking at all the totality around everything regarding the slavery, right? The totality of Scripture. And so if we take a pile of verses and we take a pile of other verses, these verses seem to be saying, yay, God's for slavery and owning people. And these verses seem to be saying, no, slavery bad, kidnapping people bad. You were slaves. You be nice to the alien. You be nice to the outsiders. In the New Testament, you were once as foreigners. You were once exiles. And then there's no Jew or Greek. There's no slave or free. When we compare Scripture interpreting Scripture, that's where I think you get the case for the abolitionist movement. That, from my vantage point, I would say other Christians as well.
So there's a lot to say. I want to talk about Ephesians, actually, but what you just said something a second ago, and I
Scripture
forgot what it
Scripture.
Was. And it was something about looking at the Old
pile of verses. Old Testament, New Testament.
Yeah, I can't remember what it is. I can't remember what it is I was going to say, but maybe it will come back to me. We can just talk about Ephesians, because you brought this up twice now. This verse, there is neither slave nor free.
I think I misspoke. That's actually Galatians. Ephesians 6 is when he talks about how masters and slaves are to interact. Yeah. No slave or free, as I think is Galatians.
So neither, I'm no nitpicker, so I'm not going to stress that point. neither slave nor free. The interesting thing about this verse from Galatians is that whenever anybody brings it up to say that, this indicates that, I remember what I was going to say now, we'll come back to it. Okay. This indicates that, God is like anti-slavery, that he doesn't think that slaves should be a thing on planet Earth, right? People don't realize that when they say that, they commit themselves to a radical gender abolitionism too. Because what is the rest of the verse, Ruslan? Like, what does it say in full?
Are you talking about,
it says,
there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek? Yeah. You're all one in Christ.
It says, Jew nor Greek, male nor female.
Male nor female,
all one in Christ. Now, how do we interpret that? Is God saying that there is no such thing as gender, and we should all be genderless people on planet Earth? No, what he's saying is that your earthly status
Where are you taking this, Alex?
Is irrelevant to your salvation in Christ. To your salvation in Christ.
Amen.
Right? So, like,
Amen.
When he says there is neither male nor female, but we're all one in Christ. If I were like some left-wing gender theorist, and I came on your show and I said, this proves that God thinks that there should be no gender, you would say that is a gross misreading of the Scripture. He's clearly not advocating for the abolition of gender just because he says there's no male or female in Christ. If that's the case, then when he says there's neither slave nor free, we must have the same reading and say that he is not advocating for the abolition of these statuses on planet Earth. If anything, he's reaffirming them, because he's saying that although there is slave and there is free on planet Earth, you're all one in Christ. If he didn't believe in that distinction, that verse wouldn't make any sense. So I think people pull this out of context. I think they say, well, God said there's neither slave nor free.
Okay.
He also said that there's neither male nor female, and you have to pick which way to interpret that verse. And I think the natural reading is that God was reaffirming that those statuses do exist on Earth, but won't exist as relevant to your salvation in Christ.
Okay, that's fair. I see how you come to a conclusion. I guess what I'm getting at is when I look at those verses, because we're all one, meaning because in Christ people have, there's also the Imago Dei, but then there's the salvation aspect. I think the male nor female thing was a radical empowerment to women's rights and women having the ability to do things. I mean, what you probably will remember this better. The Roman emperor writing about 2 slave women leading a church, and they're called deacons, and they're getting other slaves and other children. This is the lowest of the low within that context. So I think that's a radical, I wouldn't say dismantling of the gender binary. Like, I don't think that's what you're arguing either. But I do think that it's saying a lot in terms of a view that, it elevates women. Absolutely, it elevates women, and I think it elevates slaves. And I think if a man is functioning in a way that's harmful hierarchically, or within the patriarchal system, I think Paul is saying, hey, like, you need to treat women better. You need to treat slaves better. And again, we already agreed that it wasn't the same type of slavery as we've seen within the transatlantic slave trade, right? Yeah. So
the question I was going to ask earlier then was this: do you think it is true that at least at one point God considered some human beings to be the private property of other human beings?
Do I think at some point? That's a great question. I would say that it seems like, for whatever reason, God was working within these systems that because of God's word were abolished later, and whether that was them being able to divorce their wives without good cause, whether that was polygamy, that God still worked within those messes that were the byproduct of human fall and human institutions, not that God was prescribing those messes. That's the best I could do on that answer, Alex.
When you talk about divorce, for example, right? When God permits divorce in the Old Testament, that means that there are some people in human history who've been divorced, who God has properly considered to be actually divorced.
Okay.
Right, because he allowed it at that point, right? And what I'm asking is, similarly, is there a point in history where God thinks that a human being is the private property of another human being? And that's God's view.
Yeah. I think I said there's a context in which within history that when you look at what was the alternative for someone to be someone's bondservant, or for someone to be destitute, a woman to turn into a sex slave, which is much worse, starve. Yeah, I think within that context, within that framework, polygamy was allowed, not endorsed. Slavery was allowed, not endorsed. And God is creating parameters. This is the overflow of the Christian virtue ethic, right?
Slavery seems to be endorsed. And again, to be clear, we're talking about a specific kind of slavery here. I still don't think it's that good, antebellum levels. But to say it's not endorsed, like God actually instructs like people in how to take slaves. So that like when you march up to attack a city, this is in Deuteronomy, first make its people an offer of peace. And I'm doing this from memory, so please fact check me. Makes people an offer of peace. If they accept the peace, then they shall be subject to forced labor for you. That's like some peace. And it's if if they don't accept this peace, with scare quotes, that you then lay siege to that city, right? So we're told that this is what should happen. Likewise, if among the captives, this is elsewhere, if among the captives of one of these conquests of the Old Testament, God says in the general sense, you notice a woman who is attractive, and it literally says this, like you notice a beautiful woman and you want her to be your wife. Then you take her home, you shave her head and trim her nails, I think, in like this bizarre ritual. You then give her 30 days to mourn her dead husband, who you may have just yourself killed, and then she becomes your wife. So there are instances in the Bible where it's not just like, oh, man, okay, fine, I know you're doing this, and I'm just going to like hold my tongue for now. It's like, no, go forth and do this, you know. And I think that is a problem for Christianity.
Yeah, I understand how you can come to that conclusion. I think those are tough passages. I think that there's all kinds of explanations probably given about those passages. In a very macro sense, I see those passages as God working within flawed means and not God endorsing those. And I see how you can come to your conclusions. Again, Dan also drove some of this point home, so I'm not upset about that. I get it. I would just say, man, allowance is not the same as endorsement, and that's kind of where I would land. But yes, there's probably people that have gone deeper.
I've just shown. I hope the audience understands how I at least tried there to show that there is an endorsement, not just
you see it as an endorsement. I guess, and I would just say I personally don't see it as an endorsement. I'm looking at it in the grand scheme of like people have always conquered people within history. People have always ravaged and did terrible things to other people, and perhaps there is a boundaries being set around how you are going to do this in light of what's always happened throughout civilization. Now, we would look at that from our modern lens and be like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, but this is how civilization has always functioned, and God is trying to create parameters. That would be my claim for it. I haven't given a whole lot of thought.
I think what religion is supposed to be for, what divine revelation in particular is supposed to be for, is telling people where they're going wrong. So, for example, when the ancient Israelites are worshipping other gods, God is pretty unforgiving about this. He's like, stop doing that now. And this is obviously something it's hard for us to understand these days, just how difficult that was for them. And they keep falling back into pagan worship. Like, it's obviously an incredibly difficult thing to do for them. But God found it important enough that he said, I don't care how difficult it is for you, stop it now, right? Yet with slavery, he didn't seem to quite have the same urgency, let's say, about it. Not only this, but when we do move to the New Testament, there are again a sort of hodgepodge of verses here. I think that the Galatians one isn't relevant. I think that Paul says, slaves be good to your masters, but also says masters be good to your slaves, which is a very progressive thing of Paul to say. Sure. But then in 1 Peter, as you probably know, in the second chapter of 1 Peter, we read, slaves in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Now, in fairness, Peter, or whoever wrote First Peter, then does go on to say, "For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they're conscious of God," which seems to imply that this suffering is unjust, right? But it does still tell them that they must submit out of reverent fear of God to their inconsiderate masters, to the cruel ones, to the froward, as the King James likes to say.
Yes. So can I just briefly respond and then we can move on. So I think quite simply, like if God was having trouble getting them to not worship false gods, false idols, right? I can't imagine then them also being able to not have slaves. Right? Like God is like, man, you knuckleheads, I keep showing up. I keep doing these miracles. I love you guys. I'm trying to create a way. And you can't even stop worshiping false idols. When I keep delivering, I keep showing myself. I would just say, man, I think it's a bit of a stretch to be like, and then he could also get them to stop owning slaves. Now, that would be my position on that. Go ahead.
By the way, but we're talking about a different kind of slavery here, right? So like if I speak to a Christian and they say, yeah, I think God did endorse slavery, but like slavery was kind of okay because it was necessary at the time and it wasn't as bad. And I'm like,
very different.
You're like,
yes.
fine.
Yeah. Which yes, and
doesn't support
Alex,
slavery, which I think is
yes,
false.
absolutely. So I would say yes, and that the context of the type of slavery was very different, and God is still trying to just get them to stop worshiping false gods on top of trying to get them to end slavery. Like it just seems like a
little bit of Jesus better than
a little bit of Jesus is better than no Jesus, Alex. You know, God is working on these people that are clearly stiff necks, hard hearts, and he's trying to move them along in the process. And we've already agreed that it's different slavery. And I will even take it a step further. And I'm not sure if you're kind of alluding to this, but yeah, I would say there are certain economic systems where slavery may even be of benefit. When you're talking about someone being destitute, when you're talking about someone becoming a sex slave versus being a house slave, I would say, yeah, there's a time and place where the specific bond servant type of slavery could even have a net positive for someone versus them going destitute out into the wilderness and dying, starving, or being someone's sex property. Yes, I would say that there's a better for that. So I don't have a problem with saying that, and I think you've kind of alluded to
soundboard. Where's that soundboard when you need it? You know, the little.
Why is the soundboard not working?
I don't know. It's not working right now.
It's not working on this.
I've hit it a couple times on this stream and it doesn't go.
I know. Oh, wait a minute. No, I know it. Here we go. Here it goes.
We got it. Here we go.
That's a bit of a shame.
There you go. Just for you.
What's the other one? There's another one. What's the other one you do?
Is that it?
No, it's not a boom. It's like a that one. That's the one. That's those ones. That's what I'm hearing played. Now, in fairness, I agree with you, but you know, like I mean, I know what you're saying.
Yes.
Unfortunately, if we, like you said earlier, that Scripture begins with permitting but not allowing slavery. I already think that's kind of wrong, but fine. And so like it's revelatory, you know, it goes on and later it will condemn slavery. I'm like, okay, well, I can't wait for that text to show up because yes, we do have a New Testament. If the best like addressing of this all important issue of slavery you can find is something like love your neighbor or something like references to slavery, which sort of go back and forth and are at times a bit unclear. But the idea that like the most effective way that the New Testament could have done away with slavery is with the contents that it has, I think is laughable. That tells me that might just be fine because you might not think that that's the project of the New Testament, but that tells me that that is not the project of the New Testament. And like I say, Jesus at least implicitly.
I don't think I claimed that was the project of the New Testament. Yeah, I was saying the Christian virtue ethic. Yeah, the Christian virtue. Let's move on. Can we move on?
Of course.
Because I got other stuff for you. Okay, so I have a non-combative, non-believer thing that I really want to come back to. I want to drop an idea on you about. Are you still doing debates or not? Not really. Because I feel like your content's kind of shifted.
I did one recently with Cliff and Stuart Connectly, but it was kind of like it was a shame because I've always said that debates are not a great way of sort of getting to truth. I mean, I even think the conversation we're having right now is like way more interesting than debates that people put on. But I thought, you know, all right, I'll do this because why not? Let's give it a go. And I'm doing this one with David Wood as well. But I'm kind of hoping with David Wood, it's going to be like formal, you know, opening statements and stuff. And I'm hoping that it will just be in the spirit of like, you know, conversational exploration. Obviously, I'm going to be defending my view. But it's something about the style. And that debate with the Connectleys got very heated very fast. And I'm not even still quite sure how it happened. But the contrast between my 3-hour conversation with the Connectleys on my podcast and the debate that we had, whereas in the 3-hour podcast, we spoke, we got on. It was really nice. Had a nice time. Stuart gave me a lift to the train station afterwards. Like, awesome. In the debate, instantly it just falls apart. Just shows me that there's something dubious about that. It's theatre, and there's nothing wrong with theatre. We like theatre, but it's like a boxing match. The boxing match will tell you who's better at boxing. It won't tell you who's actually a better fighter.
Yeah, I think, you know what I think it is? I think it's that was remote, and I think remote is really difficult. And even in our conversation today, there's times where there's a delay and we're cutting each other off. I got to be really intentional to hear you out versus in person. So I think in person, in my opinion, tends to do well. And I'm excited for that. Yeah, just for those who don't know, February 15th, Modern Day Debates is hosting Alex O'Connor versus David Wood. Is Jesus God in the New Testament?
Live, by the way, it's not is Jesus God. It's does Jesus claim to be God? Because that's
Jesus claim to be God?
A difficult. That's a complaint people make too. But this is in person, by the way. This is a live event in Newark. So if you want to spend your Valentine's Day in the romantic city of Newark, New Jersey, then tickets are on sale. So go and find them on. It'll be Modern Day Debate, whatever. Like Google it, and you're all internet savvy people. I'm sure that you can find it.
I'll be there in person as well.
So the nature of the debate.
Alex, are you still in? You still live in London, or are you out in America, or where do you stay nowadays? I think London, right?
I'm based in the UK, but I'm traveling like a lot. So I'm in America quite often.
Very cool. Okay, sweet. I'm trying to think if there's any.
Where'd you get that awesome bookshelf behind
you? I've been meaning to ask you about this bookshelf because that looks like a background.
Yeah,
that thing looks like a background, but it's an actual physical bookshelf, right?
Yeah, it's a chest of drawers. Presuming you're talking about the one that looks
sorry,
a bit more psychedelic. It is a chest of drawers. I don't know its origins. We picked it up years and years ago, like as a sort of piece of the living room in my family home when I was a kid on like Facebook Marketplace. And then it made a few appearances in some old videos, and it became a massive meme in the early days of the channel, like really, really big meme. And then they went away. And finally, for 1 million subscribers, I brought them back again because I got a delivery van just for like these drawers to bring them back specially. So a lot of people didn't realize that they were an old classic of the channel, but the OG viewers know what's up. So
is it a metaphor?
I'm not sure how good of a background it actually makes, but I thought I'd want to keep it for a little while given the effort that I put into it.
Is it a metaphor for how when you break the structure of something normal, yet it can still stand? Maybe there's something there. We can work through that.
Maybe
that's great.
Maybe
okay. Let's dive into. I have a question for you on the problem of evil, and then I'm gonna have a what I think is an interesting argument, because you say you are a non-combative non-believer who wants to believe, and I have a theory for you. Okay, an idea, an experiment for you. Okay, so the problem of evil. You said in your video with Chris Williamson that you think if we were to time travel in the future, or if people 200 years from now, they'll be able to figure out why fine-tuning of the universe exists, but we still won't have an answer for the problem of evil.
Oh, sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
I think that's likely.
Yeah. So a bit about my story, you probably don't know much about me. Like, originally a refugee from Baku, me and my family fled because of persecution against Armenians. We come to America, all kinds of religious persecution, trauma, things that I remember, Soviet Union, communism, then to coming to America, my mom and my dad splitting, my mom spiraling, being an alcoholic for 5 years, me being in a Armenian apostolic church where I was sexually assaulted by some of the older altar boys, hating God, hating the church. And the problem of evil was my reason why I was no longer a believer. At the age of 11, I got arrested. Just a pretty rough childhood. And that was the thing that kept me from coming to Jesus, was like, there is no God. And if there is a God, he definitely doesn't like me or want anything to do with me. Right. And so I had to sort through this as like, really the very first thing in my faith journey. Right. We didn't grow up going to church in Baku because we were under the Soviet Union and communism. And then when we came to church here, I get sexually assaulted by the older altar boys when I was like 7 or 8. And then the church remarried my dad, and my mom claims that they were still together. So there's a lot of hostility towards the church, a lot of hostility towards God, a lot of hostility towards the problem of evil, a lot of personal issues that I had as a kid. And I had to sort through this. And so for me, I've seen it up close and personal. I've seen evil. I've seen some really dark things, and I've done some really dark things in my life when I was a kid, you know. And so there's the theodicies that explain away the problem of evil. And if I'm being honest, Alex, I don't want anybody to go through what I had to go through as a kid. I don't want anybody to grow up in that sort of environment. I have a kid now, he's 10 years old, and the complete trajectory for his life is so much different than what I experienced at 10 years old, right? And I got a 4-year-old, and her life is so much different. Yet, despite all of that, I wouldn't have changed a thing about my life. Despite all of the bad things that happened, the bad things that happened led me to where I am today, right? And I'm happy in a weird way that, like, within God's providence, it's not that God caused those things to happen, but for whatever reason, I hold to Romans 8:28, that all things work for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And so as you've kind of said that, it sounds like that's your biggest, I don't want to speak for you, but it sounds like that's a big thing for you, like the problem of evil, specifically you've talked about the problem of suffering, of animals. Have you ever really sat with the theodicies around this stuff? Have you ever really considered the idea that God does work all things for good, that we can make sense of evil, that though bad things do happen to good people, that there is a reason we may not know on this side of eternity, versus just kind of thinking it's just kind of chaotic and random, and that God should stop it if a God does exist? Like, have you ever really sat with the theodicies and engaged with those? And again, I don't know anything about your childhood or your upbringing. Perhaps you've endured some evil things as well, which has kind of caused you to wrestle with this as well. So that's kind of my question for you, specifically about the problem of evil, because, man, I think there's purpose to pain. I think suffering makes us stronger, you know, and I think there's a beauty to going through it that, again, though God is not endorsing it, but he does allow it. Thoughts on any of that?
Well, yeah, of course I have thought about this, and I'm familiar with at least all of the popular theodicies that people like to put forward. The problem is that once you use the word theodicy, which is a kind of technical philosophical term, you reduce an experience like the one you've just articulated to a syllogism on a page, which feels conversationally inappropriate. Like, the first thing to note is that this is like a different kind of conversation. But since you asked me to do it, like the kind of theodicy that you're alluding to there is a kind of instrumental view of what suffering is for. It leads to something that is worth having either for its own sake or worth having more than not having the suffering. So,
well said.
The problem that I have with this view, and I don't like to attach it to anybody's personal experiences because it's up to them to decide how they view their past. But in principle, if somebody goes through some negative experiences but gets something good out of it and says, well, I'm glad that I went through that because of the good thing I got. If they were offered the opportunity for their children, say, firstly, like whether you would want your children to go through the same experience, it's given that at the end of it, you think you're glad that you had it and you wouldn't change a thing, whether you want to put your children to do the same thing. Now imagine that you could give your children the good stuff that you got out of it without giving them the bad stuff. Then I think it would be the case that if you still gave them the bad stuff, it would be an egregious like misuse of your authority. Now, people are going to want to say, but you can't not give them the bad stuff, because if you don't give kids, a bit of discipline, then they're never going to learn. If you don't scare them a bit, they're never going to learn bravery. But I'm saying, like, if you could just give them bravery without fear, like that would be pretty cool. I think in some cases you can't do that. So I think bravery is like conceptually reliant on fear. I don't think you can be brave if you're not scared. The question then becomes for situations like that, because, for example, is chemotherapy a good thing? Yes, because it cures or sometimes comes close to curing cancer. But it's not intrinsically a good thing. It's instrumentally a good thing, because you wouldn't have it just for its own sake, right? It's a horrible thing. It's like a really horrible thing to go through, but it brings this good result. In this case, it's at least conceivable that there could be a situation in which somebody doesn't have cancer and also doesn't need to go through chemotherapy. So in that case, if you gave them chemotherapy anyway, if you gave them cancer so that you could give them chemotherapy, you'd say, I understand that you think chemotherapy is good, but it's only good insofar as this bad thing exists, and I'd rather have neither of them. So some of them are more like the chemotherapy, and some of them are more like bravery, and that they're literally conceptually related. And in the cases of ones that are like bravery, where you can't have bravery without fear, I think I'd probably just rather have neither. But in the case of like instrumental goods, like you're describing, I think it would be gross to say how glad we could be that we have cancer, because without cancer we wouldn't have the good of chemotherapy. That is sort of what it rings. That's what rings through my ears when I hear people use this kind of theodicy. It sounds a bit like that, because it's very difficult to step outside of how the world actually in fact works. It's very difficult to shake off this idea that, no, yeah, I'm glad I had bad experiences because they made me who I am. It's like, if you could have been made who you are in the same way without going through the suffering, I think that would have been a preferable life. But I'm not saying that of you, I'm saying that in general.
But is that even possible though? Like I think of like strength training, and I think of anything. Right. You grinding out your YouTube channel. You've been doing this longer than I have. You've been faithful to it. You suffered. You've suffered to get to where you're at. You know, you've been doing this since you were a teenager. Strength training. You're literally tearing apart muscles to rebuild better muscles, and then you got to get your diet and your nutrition locked in. All of life seems to be suffering, right? It's just, do we get to choose the suffering, or does the suffering choose us based on people sinning against us? And the end result is the same. My kids will have to go through some degree of suffering. Right now, suffering is I didn't get to watch today. Mommy and daddy didn't get me to watch today. I still was a thorn for the day. I didn't get to watch, right? But we all will have to go through various degrees of suffering, and that ultimately is for our good. Now, I get your cancer parallel. That's a strong argument in terms of chemo versus, creating chemo to fight the cancer. But gosh, could we just not have either? And I mean, again, there's probably people that have gone through that process, and we've lost people to cancer. You know, we've lost young people to us who just tragically died, and we don't know why. When I was 19, my best friend died. He was 20 years old. I don't know why. You know, I don't have those answers, but I do believe that that's the beautiful part about the Christian worldview, because I don't have to go beyond Jesus himself to make sense of suffering, because I follow a suffering servant, and it makes sense of the next life, the new heaven, the new earth, the hope that maybe one day it will all click and it will make sense, though I don't have the answers, and there's a mystery that I'm okay with living. There's a tension I'm okay with living in, versus just kind of saying, man, it's all chaos and just, you know, like it just sounds like a darker story, you know?
So there are two approaches to this conversation. One is to say, I don't know why they're suffering, but I'm okay with that mystery as a Christian, and that's fine. But the other is, if you are having a discussion or a debate and we're talking about the problem of evil as an argument against the existence of God, that's where appealing to mystery doesn't work, like in that context, right? So to be clear, if you're a Christian, that's what I think faith is, by the way. Faith is not belief without evidence, it's belief without direct evidence. It's something like, you know, the example that's often given is, how do you trust that your chair isn't going to fall apart? And you say, well, I have confidence that's going to happen because of all the other times that I've sat in the chair. So it's like, you still have no direct evidence that like that chair isn't going to collapse, but you have a lot of other separate confirming evidence that makes you sort of, and that's what faith is. It's belief without evidence here, but you've got enough evidence in the background, right?
Yes.
So faith in God in this instance is like, in the background, you've got enough to know that he exists and that he's good. And so anywhere that you don't know, you have faith. That's not exactly blind because you've got that stuff in the background, but it's blind to those specific issues. That is fine. Like if somebody has a list of arguments for God's existence, like the contingency argument or something, and they think that this deductively demonstrates the existence of God, and if they also think that the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection makes that the most likely version or something, so they just believe that God exists and it's Christian God, then they could just say, well, I don't know why they're suffering, but I know that there's a good God who exists, so I know that there must be an explanation. Like, that's fine. It's called skeptical theism. Like, it's fine. Like that, there's nothing like wrong with that view. But of course, that doesn't do anything to actually counter the problem of evil. Like, if you want to talk about the problem of evil, then it's like, let's have an opinion on it, right? And I don't know is a legitimate opinion, but that just means that we're not having this conversation, right?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I know from my own life, based on my own experience, on how I process the problem of evil in very real suffering that I've gone through personally and that I've recently experienced. We recently had a loss in the family, and I know in my own life. However, I can't ascribe a working framework for everyone's suffering. You know, so I'll say, why do people suffer on a grand scale?
Yeah, not everybody like interprets their suffering in the same way. I know a lot of people who've suffered who would rather have not gone through it. You know,
that's fair. Yeah.
And maybe they just haven't discovered the reason yet. Maybe there is some reason. I think as a Christian, you kind of have to believe that there must be some kind of reason.
Yes.
But I think that bearing in mind that like you're talking to somebody who's not a Christian, so that background info isn't there, what I'm faced with is a lot of suffering. And by the way, like I said, I place less emphasis on the philosophy of religion these days, partly because I don't think you can ever actually establish anything. Like if we could have done, we would have done it already, you know?
Yeah. Do you have a solution? Do you have a solution for the problem solving in your worldview, or like the agnostic atheist, or does it not even matter? Like it's a non sequitur because you're not looking for a good God in your worldview.
Yeah, well, atheism, insofar as I'm an atheist, which is to say, I mean, I've always been more of an agnostic, but a lot of that's, well, not always, sorry. I mean, like, although in a way, because the online atheist community always used to sort of stress that atheism is just a lack of belief in God. And that became like a huge debate like 5-10 years ago. It was like a big thing. And so I think actually even at the time, like, you know, when pressed, you'd say, well, I just don't believe that there is a God, which probably broadly puts you in the ballpark of agnosticism. But there are still arguments against God's existence, like the problem of evil. You might not think that they establish the falsity of theism, but they are positively atheist arguments. But atheism as a worldview, insofar as it is a worldview, doesn't really have much content. Certainly agnosticism does not. And so when people like to say, well, what does your worldview offer? It's like, nothing, but it's not supposed to, you know? Like Bill Maher once said that atheism is a religion in the way that abstinence is a sex position. And that's at least true of agnosticism. It's like, well, what kind of sexual thrill does abstinence give you? Well, none, but that's kind of the point.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I have one more question about this, but just as a side note, and forgive me for my brain working this way. What do you make? Have you ever saw David Wood's through line in terms of, hey, new atheism, which is intentionally secularized everything, and now look at the fruit of new atheism, and you got Richard Dawkins saying he wants to bring back the cathedral and the Christmas carols, and he's afraid of the Muslims, and he's afraid of the radical gender people, right? And so, like, you got rid of Christianity, and
can't take the boomer out of the atheist.
Yeah, can't say. But now now these guys want to be cultural Christians, and because they're like, oh man, well at least that was better than what we got when we removed. Do you see the through line there, or would you say they're totally separated?
Richard Dawkins is an interesting example because, of course, he's been actually saying this since the publication of The God Delusion. This isn't like the result of new atheism has caused him to think this. He's always thought this. It just came to sort of prominence again because of his LBC interview. My friend John Nelson has said in the past that Richard Dawkins does have all of the makings of a perfectly good Anglican. That is, he likes evensong, he's got an affinity for religious architecture, and he doesn't believe in God. Richard Dawkins is quite, and it's quite clearly always been this. In fact, the last time I think I saw him, I did an event with him in Oxford, and so I sort of said like, "Oh, how's it? You know, what have you been up to?" Like, and he's. And I said to him, kind of embarrassed. So I sort of said to him, "Well, I'm back in Oxford, and so I actually went to evensong because I do like listening to the Magdalen College Choir because, you know, it's a beautiful choir, you know." But yeah, I was like, gosh, telling the most famous atheist in the world that I was kind of in a chapel last night, and he said, "Oh, so did I. I went to evensong as well at New College." Well, okay,
look at you guys. You guys are all churchgoers, Alex.
So I don't think it's anything to do. Although I must say I've been to enough now that they do even evensong has kind of started to bore me. I certainly can't sit through a traditional mass. I've been to a couple of Latin masses, and those are the worst.
We got to take you to rock and roll church with us, Alex.
Yeah, I've always wanted to do like a mega church type situation.
That's one thing that
we got you, bro. That'd be a wonderful video.
That'd be a great video. Touring a mega church with Alex O'Connor. Okay.
The thing
go ahead.
Is,
I'm sorry. Did you have more here?
It's like a lot of people. There's this feeling in the air that new atheism is being regretted by new atheists. That they realize that they've created a monster.
Well, Ion Hershey has said that kind of, right?
Yeah, Ion Hershey said that. That's right. She firmly believes that. I can't remember her exact words or anything, but yeah, she's of that view. Dawkins himself, I'm not sure. I think culturally there is a bit of a shift, but I'm not sure how much, strictly speaking, new atheism is to blame for that. It's quite hard to say.
And
it's difficult to know if new atheism is a result of like the removal of God from society or a cause of it. Like there's a reason why it was such a successful publishing phenomenon, and it might not be because people started becoming convinced. It might be because people started feeling validated. You know what I mean? Might have already been happening.
You see, but you have to see some of the irony of a Richard Dawkins advocating so strongly, a Bill Maher advocating so strongly, and then fast forward 15 years later, Westerners are less religious than they've ever been, and now all of a sudden, allegedly there's 10,000 mosques opening up in your country. The most common name is Muhammad. You want your Christmas carols back. You want your cathedrals back. The stuff that's happening over here with gender,
It's quite shocking. Of course, one must bear in mind that Muslims are far more likely to name their children Muhammad than any other name. Which
for sure. I'm saying like everything is changing.
I still do think it is. I still do think it's like shocking, right? When you read that like the most popular boy's name in England is Muhammad, or maybe it's just London. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, people are upset about the changing cultural face of their nation, and the difficulty is how much that can be ascribed to atheism, because I think that when it comes to stuff like that, like when you're talking about too many Mohammeds in England, I think more people are going to be looking towards open border immigration policy, starting with Tony Blair, right? They're not going to be looking to the publication of The God Delusion and the End of Faith. And I'm not sure if Tony Blair had read The Blind Watchmaker and become convinced that God didn't exist, and that's what caused him to open the border and promote the kind of immigration that has led to this change of the cultural landscape of the UK.
That wasn't my argument.
It's hard to draw that link,
I simply was saying that when you remove Christianity from the zeitgeist, something is going to fill that void. You can only be anti-God for so long. You can only be anti-faith so long. Something is going to, and whether that's wokeism or whatever we want to call it, leftism, radical Marxism, whatever you want to call it on the left, or you're going to get Islam, something is going to fill that void, and something is going to take over, and that's what it seems has happened. Now, again, you to your point, maybe you can blame New Atheism, maybe you could blame just policy, maybe it's a combination of the two, but I don't know. But it's just an interesting thought that I've heard. I've seen David Wood make this argument over and over again, and I thought, man, that's actually a pretty good argument.
Policy is informed by religion. Like if it was still the case that England took itself seriously as like a Christian nation, and that's how it identified itself, we might have seen a different policy manifest when it comes to immigration, but it's kind of impossible to say. I think that in particular, looking at like Richard Dawkins was quite upset about the celebration of Ramadan. I think there was it might have been like on St. George's Day or something, when there was some kind of, or maybe some other time, I can't remember what time it was of year, when there was something to do with Islam up on Regent Street, and people thought it should have been like British flags or something like this. And Richard Dawkins is upset about this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, like maybe that's because of atheism, but maybe it's just because of globalization and open border immigration and that kind of stuff. I'm more inclined to think that's the case. By the way, the same thing is possibly true of things like architecture. People complain about secular architecture a lot, and they think it's kind of disgusting. All modern buildings are disgusting and crap, and they look so ugly and stuff. And they say, well, if we were still Christian, we'd still be building cathedrals and stuff. Firstly, a lot of London, for example, was very ugly at the time those cathedrals were built. If you look at the Westminster Abbey or the Palace of Westminster, I suppose those are near Whitehall, but like look around London at the same time and you will find slums. You will find people living in the dirt on the street in their own urine. You know what I mean? Like it was always going on. And we ask, why is it now that even when we spend a lot of money on buildings, they still are ugly then? Like, why is that the case? Is that because like we don't have a belief in God or care for beauty? Like maybe partly. I think we definitely don't care about beauty, that's for sure. But it might also have to do with the fact that we just have to build so many darn buildings. And a lot of that has got to do probably with the increase in the population. And a lot of that has got to do with immigration. Now, where might you get the idea that, you've heard it said that there are national borders and a national identity, but I say to you, like, treat everybody as your equal and love your brothers, even love your enemies. Think like this is a possible extension of the Christian ethics, this opening of the doors, which brings people in to the extent that it affects the secular architecture. So in my view, the ugly buildings that we see being built at a record rate are in fact possibly an outgrowth of Christianity. So who knows? It's impossible to say, but we can agree that the modern world is ugly.
Yeah, no, that was good. That was good. You blamed it all on Jesus. I like it.
It's easy to do, right? Like if I were to write a book and I said like, the collapse of Christian society. Ironically, the collapse of Christian society is due to Christianity. It'd be like kind of cool and interesting and stuff. But like that's what people are doing.
You could argue that Christianity or Protestantism specifically helped inspire the Enlightenment, and Enlightenment is where you got some of these downstream effects. So I see how you can connect that through. Do you think that, do you see any validity to the statement that leftism or radical gender ideology, I don't wokeism, whatever you want to call it, that in and of itself is also religious? Like that is a worldview with religious undertones, that is a worldview that has an immaterial soul that could be born in the wrong body, and that it has a lot of the frameworks. And again, when you remove Christianity and God of the Bible, you get something worse, right? Whether Islam or...
I know literally what you mean. But it is like quite impossible to determine the necessary and sufficient conditions of the word religion. Like even within world religions, like it is famously difficult to define what a religion is. So like,
how about cult?
For example, a lot of people, I think that's also unhelpful because by the definition that might be relevant here, Christianity would be a cult. And cult isn't necessarily a dirty word, you know, like sure, Christianity is a big cult. That doesn't make it a bad thing necessarily. But it's kind of a terminological game. What I'm interested in is so for example, not is wokeism a religion, but does this kind of thinking rely on something specific? Like, does it rely on superstition in the same way? Does it require belief in a creator deity? Does it, like, what are the specific things we're talking about? And it ticks some of those boxes and not others, but that's just ideology, you know?
Gotcha.
And this mixture of politics and religion is a very difficult thing to tease apart because, like, it's difficult to know, like, to what extent those are psychologically active in someone's minds. Even when you think about beautiful religious architecture, the most beautiful building interior in the world, in my view, is the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. I don't know if you've been to Paris, and I don't know if you've been to Sainte-Chapelle. Have you been to the Sainte-Chapelle?
Let me look it up. I've been to a lot of places, but let me look it up.
In Paris.
It is a phenomenal little chapel.
Oh yeah. Me and my wife have been here before.
It's surrounded by these incredible stained glass windows which tell the story from Genesis to the New Testament of the Bible. And it's not there in its entirety, but all of these tiny little panels all telling the story of the Bible. And then right at the end, the rightmost panel has like the story of the French king, like appended onto the end of it. Because like it's like a beautiful religious building that's, you know, glorifying God or whatever, but it's quite clearly also being motivated by the glorification of the king. And in fact, he puts himself sort of as the successor of this entire so it's sort of like, well, what motivated the building of Sainte-Chapelle? Was it because they were so Christian and everyone believed in God? Or was it because there was a lot of money invested in an egotistical king? Like, it's kind of hard to say. I think all of that kind of discussion is incredibly speculative. By the way, when we left the Sainte-Chapelle, which is, as I say, the most beautiful interior, I mean, it is just stunning. But because it's all stained glass windows, from the outside, it's just black. And we walked outside and it was a construction zone. And I was like, "Man, isn't it amazing?" I said to my Christian friend who was with me, "Isn't it amazing that, like, it's the most beautiful building in the world from the inside, but like when you look at it from the outside, it's like, it just looks so unimpressive." And he said, like, "Oh, that's just like Christianity itself. It's not quite the same when you look at it from the outside."
That's good. Okay. Last question. Again, to go back, have you, and we don't need to go super deep on it, but have you engaged with the theodicies that Cameron from Capturing Christianity has presented to you on the suffering of animals? Because he's kind of pointed that out. I pointed that out in my last video. You said there are no theodicy, or I don't know if you said there are no theodicies, but you said something along the lines of there's no explanation for the suffering of animals. You were a vegan once upon a time. Have you engaged with the specific ones he laid out for you?
Yeah, so I think Cameron, if I'm remembering rightly, because I'm not sure, but I think he leans quite heavily on Trent Doherty here. And Trent Doherty's book, what's it called? I did start digging into it once. I can't remember what it's called. Might be just called like The Problem of Animal Pain or something like that.
Sure.
And who was it that wrote Nature Red in Tooth and Claw? That was recommended to me by William Lane Craig. Maybe that's Trent. I'm not sure. I can't remember. I'm sorry to say. I don't remember the specific theodicies. The comment that you're referring to, I listed popular theodicies, so soul building and like heavenly compensation and also higher order goods and moral development. And I said that none of these apply to non-human animals. There might be other theodicies. And in fact, I think Cameron disputes the afterlife one. I think he gives plausibility to the idea that animals go to the afterlife in some sense.
He does.
That would help things, I think, probably. But again, it would make it difficult to explain this veil of tears in the first place. Because when you say, like, you know, in a human context, if you say, yeah, you're suffering a lot, but you're going to be essentially compensated in heaven, then one wants to ask, well, why bother with the first bit in the first place? It's like, well, because the first bit's still valuable because you learn things and your soul gets built and blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. That doesn't seem to apply to animals. They seem to get on just fine if they were sort of zapped straight up into the doggy heaven. I think they'd quite like it there. So I still don't think that explains the existence of embodied animals whose lives are oftentimes defined by suffering. It's impossible to comprehend even just the number of animals that are alive today, let alone in the history of our species. I think the number of, we have to estimate, the number of vertebrates alone is like some crazy number, 1 to the times 10 to the power of 27 or something crazy like that. And that's just an estimate. And all of these animals are suffering all the time with no view towards moral development, no soul building, no getting closer to God. It's just suffering, even if they're compensated for it.
Okay. So what you were saying in that debate with Cliff was that you didn't feel like there were, even though these theodicies have been presented to you, you didn't feel like they were sufficient enough for the gripes you have with the problem of suffering of animals. That not that they weren't any, but that you just didn't think they were sufficient.
With the exception of the afterlife one, which may apply to animals, although I think that still doesn't work. I think that the other ones just don't apply to animals. I just think that they don't. Okay. They don't work.
Got you. Okay, and then you're no longer a vegan anymore, right? So you consume meat now?
Yeah.
And is that an area of your life you feel conflicted in?
Not exactly. It was for a long time, but I think that basically it's a similar shift to what I've observed in the environmentalist movement, which I think is a good one, that if you remember 10, 20 years ago, the focus was very much make sure you turn off your lights and don't leave the tap running, right? That was what everybody would say, and we'll solve the crisis. Now that's kind of laughable. The idea that like you, Ruslan, leaving your LEDs on for too long is causing it's like, no, we need to like lobby Shell, that's obviously the way to do this. And we need government top-down regulation. Everyone recognizes that. It's a joke to suggest that the environmental crisis will be solved by bottom-up, like, grassroots activism, if you like, at least of the kind of just changing your daily habits. Activism works when you're pressuring big companies. Same thing needs to happen with veganism. Like, veganism is essentially a boycott. Veganism is a kind of boycott. It says that there is an industry that I'm not happy with, and I'm going to boycott it, and everyone else should. That, unfortunately, is not going to bring an end to factory farming. I still think factory farming is perhaps the greatest moral emergency that we're currently facing, just due to the number of animals involved, the depth of the suffering that they go through, and the extent to which it's not even recognized as a problem. It's just unimaginable what these animals go through, even if they're being treated like legally. I don't know if you know what it's like to be killed by choking on carbon dioxide in a cage. I don't either, and I hope I never find out. But you can watch videos of it happening to pigs online, and we know that there are other gases we can use that will be painless, that will essentially just put them to sleep in the way that the industry wants us to think is already happening. But they're more expensive, so we don't do it. Now,
I'm not a fan of mass farming of meat, just for the record. I think there's more ethical ways to consume it.
The conflict is that I still think that these products come from a deeply immoral source, but I feel more about it like how I would feel about any other kind of supply chain issue. So with clothing and phones and this kind of stuff, but also environmentalism, whereby what needs to happen is the government needs to say, this isn't allowed. Even then, it will still continue to happen, but we at least need to take this seriously. By the way, at least in my country, it is a legal requirement to stun an animal before you kill it. You have to. Unfortunately for pigs, the gas chambers are considered stunning and killing in the case of killing 2 pigs at one time, if you like. With cows, it's usually done with something like a stun gun. And it's a legal requirement unless you are slaughtering these animals with a religious motivation for halal or kosher meat. In that case, the animal does not have to be stunned before it's slaughtered. You can turn it upside down and slit its throat open. So that means, and by the way, you can read this on the government website, one of the requirements for halal or kosher slaughter is that the person doing the slaughtering has to be a Muslim or a Jew. So if I walked into a slaughterhouse in the UK and I turned a cow upside down and I cut open its throat and watched it bleed out on the floor, I commit a criminal offense. But if I take my shahada first and then do the same thing, suddenly
you're good
it's
to go.
permissible, and this is in a so-called secular country. I'm not so sure. So
that's fair. Like, not known to be the most free country.
Say it again, Zach.
I said not known to be the most free country. That's for sure.
Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, I think we would all probably acknowledge that the way animals are mass farmed is probably not helpful. Yet we're all to various degrees complicit.
We need to make more noise about it. I mean, it's sort of easy to say, like, you know, well, that's not really my job, that's not really my area and stuff. It's like, okay, but I think you could get a mention more often in discussions of the problem of evil and all this kind of stuff. It's like you cannot imagine some of the things that we're doing to animals. Like, it's unbelievable, man. It's seriously like piglets who are too sick to be profitable are dispatched, and the way that this is done is by taking them by the hind legs, smashing their skulls into the concrete until they die. This is known as thumping. It's blunt force trauma, and this is officially approved by the RSPCA, which is my country's Royal Society for the Protection of Animals. Sort of not regular. It's kind of a regulatory body for the treatment of animals in the UK. This is an approved method of killing these piglets. Now, there was a high welfare farm, I think somewhere in Scotland, that was found to be. It was a high welfare farm that was found to be killing piglets, thumping them by cracking their skulls against the cages, the bars of the cages that their own mothers were being kept in. Jeez. And this is the kind of stuff that just like is totally like fine. Like this is kosher. I mean, the meat's not kosher, but you know the practices are. I got you. Like all of this kind of stuff is it's a joke. It's a joke that we're allowing this to continue.
Well, I think this is why, like, supporting local farmers and trying to know where your meat's coming from. I think all that stuff else. My brother's a vegan, so I'm familiar with some of it.
By the way, this is quite funny. Sometime like a few years ago, there's a footballer called Kurt Zouma. He played for West Ham, and there was a video that he uploaded on Snapchat of him kicking his cat across the kitchen. Like he thought it was funny or whatever. He like kicked his cat across the kitchen. Now, when that happened, the mayor of London was on Good Morning Britain condemning him, saying, like, I think talking about possible legal repercussion. He was being condemned by his football club. He was being condemned by the fans. And the RSPCA confiscated his cat. That's the same RSPCA which officially
allows all this crazy stuff happening.
Thumping pigs to death.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Because they're not profitable enough to be kept alive.
Unjust scales indeed. Okay, I just got two more things for you, and maybe if we have time, we'll go to some of these super chats. Okay, let me pitch this to you as a non-combative non-believer. Okay, and I feel like you've said stuff like I want to believe. I think in your conversation with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, like I want to believe, but I just can't. And so
non-resistant it's a term from J.L. Schellenberg, and I'm certainly combative in many respects, but
non-resistant
is a different thing, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So non-resistant, you are combative, obviously within this entire back and forth about the West stuff, but non-resistant, non-believer. And it, again, in that conversation with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, like it really did seem like, it almost seems like you want to believe, you wish it were true. Is that fair language to ascribe to you?
I think that's true of the New Testament. I think that's true of the person of Jesus and his historical significance as the Son of God. Yeah.
Okay. So
I don't know. I don't think that's true of the Hebrew Bible. I'm not sure that's true of some of the later additions to the Christian doctrine.
Okay. So let me present this theory to you, and you tell me if you like it, you could hate it. Mm-hmm. So when I think of faith, right? Like I don't think faith as something that is necessarily binary. I don't think as faith as certainty. When I think of faith as trust or confidence in, right? And so if I'm looking for something that I want, I have to have a degree of confidence in it and then apply it. Meaning that Jesus said, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can say this mountain move, right? And so if I'm looking at something that I want to accomplish, I want to get into more physically better shape. I want to get shredded, right? And my friend who's in good shape, he's a trainer, he's telling me, hey, Ruslan, like, you got to cut out the processed food. You got to eat more chicken. Got to eat more broccoli, right? You got to eat, and you got to go strength training to do these things. Now, that on the surface sounds like a terrible idea. I got to eat more broccoli. I got to eat more chicken. I got to lift heavy things. I got to do hard. None of this sounds fun. But I have enough faith, Alex. I got just enough faith that, well, you know what? He has the abs and he has the physique, and it seems like he's gotten the results that I want. So my little bit of faith, I start applying the information that I have available to me, eating the chicken, eating the broccoli, doing my compound lifts, overhead press, bench press, pull up, deadlift, squat, and I start programming. I start programming my workout. And then all of a sudden what happens is I do that long enough. Some people do 75 hard, other people commit to a very long time. And then in hindsight, I look back and 6 months later, 12 months later, 3 months later, all of a sudden, Alex, I have abs. All of a sudden, there's a physical transformation that's happened to my body, and I'm pumped. I'm like, man, this is great. So now I'm on the other side of it. I had enough faith to say, I think there's something to this. He seems to have what I want. It seems to make sense on paper, but I'm not sure because chicken and broccoli and lifting sounds terrible. And I walk through the process. Now I'm on the other side of the process, and I've applied the process. And I've done this multiple times. I've done the transformation thing. And as I'm looking back in hindsight, that is where the certainty comes in for me. Meaning that there's nothing no one can tell me that's going to be contrary. Even if you gave me the best pitch for veganism, I'm going to be like, bro, chicken and broccoli works. I know it works. Sure. I know it works. I've applied it. I've lived it. I've did the bench press. I've did the squat. I've did the programming. It works. I got the results. And I know how to walk through this process and to get the said results based on the little bit of confidence that I had that what my friend was telling me was true and not a lie. Now, I'm not trying to parallel this to salvation in Jesus. I'm not trying to say that this is about the gospel. I'm just presenting you an idea that if you want to believe, have you ever thought about practicing as a Christian, going to church, doing the thing with a little bit of faith? I feel like you might, Alex, you might have enough confidence that maybe there's this mystery of the resurrection. It just may be true. That if you were to start actually practicing the Christian disciplines of church, worship, liturgy, confession, Bible study, that perhaps you walk through that for 6 months, you walk through that for a year, and then you look back in hindsight and you go, man, there's something transformative to this thing. And I still have questions and there's still mysteries, but there's something transformative to this. This Jesus thing, to Jesus living the life I couldn't live, dying to death I should have died on the cross in my place for my sins, rising on the third day, giving me a new heart, and giving me an ability to usher in heaven and goodness and beauty on this side of eternity. Have you ever explored actually applying that and walking it out, and then saying, well, let me test and see? And how do you like that version of faith, by the way? Because this is a very Jordan Peterson, very pragmatic version of faith.
When you say that what your friend said is true, you either mean it's true that by eating those foods and doing the weight training, you're going to get the physique, or you mean it's true that you're going to like it. Those are two different things, right? And I'm not sure exactly which it was.
I probably will hate it. I'll hate it. Yeah, I hated it at first.
So as in that you'll like it when it's done, like you'll like the life that it leads to.
I like the way it feels after a week of no sugar. I like the way it feels after a month of strength training.
The way you say, like, oh, I'm not sure if I believe my friend, but then I try it. It's like, well, I know for a fact that if you are in a calorie surplus and you weight train, you put on weight. If you're in a calorie detriment, or whatever the word is, deficit, and if you're just in a calorie deficit, forget the weight training, you lose weight. Like, that is just a fact. That's true, and you don't need to experience it to know that that's true. It's just demonstrable. To know whether you would prefer a certain kind of physique, like that's a totally different kind of thing. And I understand that you're not going to know that until you've actually done it. Unfortunately, I think that like the equivalent of like eating your broccoli and your chicken with religion are things which are sometimes kind of conceptually impossible. So prayer is quite important to a Christian lifestyle. And I think that in many ways, depending on the kind of person you are, prayer can be conceptually impossible if you don't already believe in God, because you can like go through the motions, but a Christian can do that too, and they wouldn't properly be praying because they're not actually talking to God. They're just saying words, right? You need to actually believe in some sense that you're communing with God. And try as I might, I cannot muster that kind of even like temporary trial belief, because I don't believe that it's true.
Not even a God, if you're real, reveal yourself. If you're real, reveal yourself to me. Jesus, if you're real, reveal yourself to me, and I'm open to it.
Yeah, that's
fine.
And
then you start walking it out. Like you can't even bring yourself to do that. Is what I'm asking you.
Again, it depends what you mean by walking it out, because I have
going to church, reading, praying, confession. Like, I'm just giving you the basics of the Christian.
I've read and I've prayed and I've done all of these things to
as a
varying
practice,
degrees.
Though? Like as a for the next 90 days, I'm gonna pretend to be Christian.
I mean, as a practice, because also thou shalt not put thy Lord to the test. Like, it starts to feel like somebody recommended to me once that you should sort of film it. You should like I had this idea. I was like, I could do a video where I like live as a Christian for like a week or a month or something, and just sort of vlog how it affects my life. It could be interesting. But I suddenly realized the moment
90 days will
filming
take.
it. The moment you're filming it, the moment you're doing it like with this scientific motivation, it kind of undermines it because your motives are off. I think that you need to come to Christ because you want to and think that it's the right thing to do, not because you just I think it's very difficult to just entertain things that you can't think are true. You can entertain them in the sense that they might be true, and you say, well, God, if you're there, then I hope you're listening to me, but you can't actually think you're like praying to God. And so something, depending on what you mean by prayer, it kind of becomes conceptually impossible. It's possible to go to church, but it's not possible to experience communion. I mean, Catholics, for example, wouldn't even want you to go up because you're not a Catholic. But even if you were in some church which allowed you to partake in the memorial, I'm well, I don't believe that this happened. I don't believe that this is doing this. I don't believe you can go through the motions, but it almost feels actually kind of offensive to do that because you're because you're just doing a parody.
Yeah, we'll give you a pass. You can go through the motions.
Christian YouTube.
So seriously, I mean to say that I probably haven't to the extent that you would feel content that I've tried my best, but it's not like I'm just been sitting around twiddling my thumbs all these years. But also the point to bring up is that I hear the same kind of testimony from all kinds of people about all kinds of things. I felt the same way as a vegan. You will never look back. I cannot believe that I was eating meat. This is unbelievable. I'm never going to, the rest of my life will be dedicated to this. And then, well, maybe not. I hear Muslims say the same thing. Bro, you just got it. You've just got to try it, man. I think if you started coming to masjid, bro, you'd be oh man, you don't even know, you'd be the greatest Muslim. It's okay, man, maybe that's true. Maybe that's actually true. And I actually think that if I were to start going to masjid and I started to hang out with Muslim circles and grow out my beard and all this kind of stuff, I'd probably start thinking, yeah, man, okay, this is kind of cool. I'm into this, because the people that you're with and the actions that you participate in just define the person that you are. Show me your friends and I'll show you the man. That's the idea.
Sure.
And so I don't think there's anything special about Christianity in that case. So given my special interest in Christianity, it makes sense for me to sort of try that in particular. But in my position as as a non-believer and a non-resistant non-believer, I should be giving about as much time to any other world religion or ideology.
I feel like you've conceded that Christianity is superior to other religions, though, in some sense. Just your explanation for why the resurrection is true, it seems like you know that there is at least a mystery there that might be onto something. It kind
of depends what you mean.
If it is superior or better or adds more net positive than other religions, and maybe you're not saying this, but the Christian doesn't experience doubt. The Christian doesn't experience dry patches of their faith. The Christian doesn't have certainty on all these things. We're all working out our salvation with fear and trembling.
You mean the Christian does have doubt, right? You mean the Christian does.
Sorry, I misspoke. Thank you. Yeah, we wrestle as well. We all wrestle through these things. And what I'm not saying is
God,
we who wrestle with God. What I'm not saying is check your brain out, because I saw Derek from MythVision always stirring the pot in here. We're not saying check your brain out and just follow your heart. I'm saying it's and both. I'm saying it's you walk it out, and as I walk it out, the more the faith grows. The more I practice, the more it grows. The more I practice, the more it grows. That is what I was getting to. But if you're hey, I have on this level, and I can't bring myself to prayer, I understand, and I would say that sounds like people just need to continue praying for you. You know what I mean? I think people need to continue praying for you, and I genuinely believe that if you wanted Jesus to reveal himself to you and you asked, I think he would. Now I think that would be complicated for you, but maybe it wouldn't. I don't know what that looks like. So this is me.
People are indeed welcome to keep praying for me. I do wish they'd stop putting their hands on me while they do it, though.
You don't like that part?
No, I respect that.
Okay.
Zach
doesn't like that.
I'm with you on that.
It just feels a little bit awkward. It's sort of like when everyone's saying happy birthday to you, except it's not even your actual birthday. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Apologies on behalf of all charismatics. Last question for you, and then maybe we'll go to some super chats. Okay, last question for you. Okay, this fascination with the Gospel of Thomas, my response to you with the Gospel of Thomas, I'm not sure if you saw, that was actually Wes chimed in and gave a reason for why the Gospel of Thomas is not.
I did see that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, before he blew up. Yeah, I saw that.
Before he blew up. Yeah. And so, and by the way, was that in any way connected to you doing the debunking videos? Was because he debunked your argument for the Gospel of Thomas?
No. I had considered doing some kind of response, because I remember when that video came out, and I went to dinner with some friends, and we were discussing it.
what is this fascination with the Gospel of Thomas? Like what
I'm
is
fascinated with it because I'm fascinated in Gospels. I'm fascinated in ancient texts. I think that I'm fascinated in the Isaiah scroll. I'm fascinated in the Iliad. I'm fascinated not so much by the Iliad. I haven't read it, but I have read some of a good chunk of the Odyssey, and I'm less interested in it. But it's all on a varying scale. I'm more interested in the canonical Gospels than I am in Thomas, for example.
Okay.
But I'm more interested in Thomas than the average Christian is. I mean, it's just the problem is what happens is I make a podcast where I say the Gospel of Thomas is really interesting. Check it out. And people go, "Oh, Alex, it's not part of the canon, blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, well, yeah, I know that. But hey, there are some interesting arguments to consider. And then people say, "Oh, why are you trying to increase the legitimacy?" It's like, well, because I'm not saying it's legitimate. I'm just saying that it might be legitimate than oftentimes Christians give it credit for. That's not to say it is legitimate. It just it's oftentimes sort of dismissed way too out of hand. And then suddenly you're obsessed with the Gospel of Thomas. It's like, I think I've made, one podcast episode on it? Ever, I think?
Well, no, you made a couple podcasts, but I feel like you bring it up a good amount. And even did you bring it up with Jordan Peterson? And even in his conversation,
I brought up Gnosticism with Jordan Peterson.
Gnosticism. We brought up Gnosticism, and he kind of rebuked you pretty sternly there with regards to why Gnosticism is not good. And so I'm not sure if you're fascinated with Gnosticism or if you.
Yeah, I'm definitely fascinated by Gnosticism.
You are fascinated by Gnosticism.
Gnosticism is a fascinating early Christian movement that, one of the things that really interests me is the extent to which it is sort of present in the Gospel of John, either as John being influenced by Gnostic ideas or as a polemic against proto-Gnostic ideas.
I would say a polemic against. Yeah.
It's incredibly interesting, but it sort of depends, because a lot of Gnostics sort of think that the prologue of John is a quite Gnostic friendly idea of the person of Jesus. And so there's a lot of interesting conversations to have about John in that regard in particular. Of course, I think it's fascinating. Jordan Peterson, unfortunately, I don't think did rebuke me. I've heard you made that claim a few times as well.
I think he did.
What is it that he said in response?
Well, I think this idea that Gnosticism presents that the material is bad, the physical is bad, and the spiritual is good. And maybe rebuked you is strong, but he definitely redirected that notion and said, no. That's Gnosticism. This is bad.
I don't think it's just too strong. I think it's a misstating of the case, because what happened was Jordan Peterson is saying that it's sort of implying to me that he doesn't care about the physicality of the resurrection. He's more into Jungian archetypes and stuff, at least at that point.
And you said that's like Gnosticism.
Point out to him that that's kind of what the Gnostics do. They don't care about the resurrection. He says, well, my problem with the Gnostics is that they don't like the material world.
Right.
That's not a rebuke. That is just a stating of what the Gnostic position is and saying that he doesn't like it. He didn't say why that's wrong. He didn't give any philosophical argument as to why we should think of the material world.
Why do you think that's wrong?
Didn't even profess towards that. I don't think it is wrong. I don't think it. I think this is one of the things that I think is fascinating about Gnosticism, is it seems to account for things like the problem of evil in its disparaging of the natural world. It also does away with it sort of solves some problems and brings up others, because the Gnostic theology, and of course Gnosticism is an unhelpful scholarly term.
Yeah, it's a broad spectrum.
Whatever. It's kind of one of my least favorite things that people do. They begin their book with 3 chapters about why they can't use the word that's in the title. It's we all know what you mean. It's a very convoluted theology, or it seems convoluted. It's sort of emanations and all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get your head around, and it seems pretty counterintuitive. But you got to understand that if that became the norm, and Valentinus was nearly the Bishop of Rome at one point, so it wasn't far off. If that had happened, then if we were living in a parallel universe where Gnosticism was the norm, and there was this idea of what we now call Catholic ideas, proto-Catholic ideas, people might say, well, that doesn't make any sense, because, if there was one God, why would there be the problem of evil? How would you explain the difference between the Hebrew Bible God and the New Testament? None of that makes any sense. All worldviews have problems like this. And my fascination with the Gnostics is in that I'm discovering this exciting, sort of new interpretation of Christianity, not new, but new to me, interpretation of Christianity that I want to explore by speaking with scholars. Yeah. I think that is more than justification enough. But I did want to point out that where you said on a number of occasions, I've heard in your videos, every time I bring up Gnosticism, you say that, well, Jordan Peterson rebuked you on this. It's I really just don't think he did. I think he literally just said what Gnosticism was and that he didn't like it. And that's fine. He doesn't have to like it, but he definitely didn't rebuke it.
okay, well, he
definitely didn't rebuke the criticism that he is doing that. He definitely didn't rebuke that.
Fair enough. He didn't rebuke the criticism, but if you say, "Hey, I like burgers," and I say, "Alex, I don't like burgers," I think that's burgers are bad.
Oh, sure. Okay, sorry. If you mean rebuke me in that sense, like me saying that he's sort of Gnostic, okay, fine. Then maybe I misunderstood you, but like he certainly didn't do away with the criticism that insofar as like he talks about the resurrection, he would be way more at home with the Gnostics than he would be with at least at that point. Since then, God knows what he's said.
So do you believe in something beyond the material world? Like that's I'm trying to understand, like, because I understand that the Gnosticism is novel to you. I get it. Fair enough. As you're going through these things. Yeah. Are you saying as an agnostic, you believe there's something beyond the physical world, beyond this material world, and therefore that is why Gnosticism makes more sense to you? Is that your position?
No, I am agnostic about like materialism, of course, because I mean consciousness is the great sort of first mystery and rebuttal of materialism. Sure. No, the thing that Gnosticism does is it has a different understanding about what's important about Jesus. So the Catholic idea, and I mean Orthodox idea, and I mean small o Orthodox, is that through the resurrection of Jesus, we're saved. A lot of Gnostic Gospels don't even mention the resurrection, which is at least fascinating. Why were there early Christian communities that didn't care about the resurrection? It shows that there is a variety of views about what's important about Christianity. And that fascinates me. So what is important to them? Like, why did that matter? What did these people believe? And why did they believe it? And then it's like, how much of a departure is that? Not from like Orthodox Christian doctrine, but from like the canonical New Testament, for example. Like how much do they run against each other? And that is a really interesting exercise. Yeah, in the same way that you
go ahead, I'm sorry.
You might think that like John's gospel kind of rubs up against like Mark's gospel in various ways. Like obviously the Gnostics are doing this in like orders of magnitude more ways, but you're asking why I'm interested in it. It's like all for the same reason.
Got it. Okay, so I think why it runs contrary is in the story of the incarnation. If the physical and the material world is bad and the spiritual world is good, Jesus defies that by being God who comes in the physical to deal with humanity's mess, to give the example of a moral teacher and a moral life, and then also die for our sins. So I think like the entire incarnation story is why the Gnostics run in stark contrast with the teachings of the Bible. And I would say that's one of the reasons, maybe Jordan Peterson didn't have the words to articulate that, but I would say that's one of the reasons why he was apprehensive to it. Because when we start getting into the physical world as bad, well, the incarnation story completely defies that. God stepping into the physical world, the Messiah, the God-man coming into the physical world. So you see how, as a Christian who believes in the literal incarnation, why it would be such a stark contrast, not to mention the issues with the dating and it coming much later.
Yeah, I mean,
the Gnostic Gospels, that is.
I mean, dating is, well, for a start, highly speculative enterprise anyway, but also it's a gradation, it's a scale. Like again, I could ask like what your parameter is, like how late could John's Gospel be, for example, to still consider it like canonical? And I think that would be a very difficult question to answer. I think it'd be an unfair one to ask. The dating itself is tricky. I mean, this is one of the things that
I think John's Gospel is first century for sure, 70 AD. I'll place it there. So but that's neither here nor there.
What makes you so sure about that?
I could pull up sources we've covered on the channel in terms of people considering it dating earlier based on what is it the one of those manuscripts that was found to be P52? Early first century. Was it P90? Was it P95? I don't know.
P90X. I think you're thinking you might be
I'm thinking about the workout.
P52 is
P52.
P52 is the
he hit me with the P90X workout back in the day. That was great.
Tony Horton.
Tony Horton, baby. P90. What is it? P55.
I think you're thinking of P52.
52. Yeah.
And
well, if it's early first century, if it's early second century, that means that the Gospel of John was already moving, and if it was moving, then it was likely written in the late first century.
Yeah, so we've come full circle. This is another thing that Wes Huff says in his podcast with Joe Rogan. Unfortunately, I do just think that is incorrect. P52 could be dated early, but like the scholarly consensus on this is also out, and we have to at least allow for a early 3rd century dating of the fragment of P52. And the John Rylands Library in Manchester.
Century. Wow. Okay. Yes.
And the John Rylands Library in Manchester, which holds P52, they say that the evidence is pointing towards a date closer to 200 AD. I think that's probably the safest bet. It's like around the 200 AD mark, right? Mm-hmm. Some people want to date it earlier. That's fine. Brent Nongbury is the person to talk to on this, and he wrote a paper in the Harvard Review of a theological review. I mentioned this in my video, called "The Use and Abuse of P52," because people use it with this apologetical motive of trying to establish the early writing of John. There are so many problems with this. The first is that you just can't confidently date it that early. It can't be done.
Sure.
So
of course, that's the argument. Others have dated it that early.
Yeah, Gavin's response to me said that, like, when I pointed out that, like, the dating of P52 is much broader than comfortably early 2nd century, let's say, which is I think what you'd need for this argument. He said, well, okay, well that allows for a later dating of John, but it doesn't mean that John's late. Well, of course it doesn't. I'm not going to say that John is late, but the idea that you can establish that John is in the 1st century because P52 was written early in the 2nd century and it had to travel around for enough time, like, if you allow for later dating of P52, then you cannot comfortably put John into the 1st century on those grounds. There might be other grounds, but P52 is not a very good one of them. That's why the paper is called "The Use and Abuse of P52." Most interesting about this to me is that, like, even if you take an early-ish dating for P52, like originally when it was found, it was thought to date between 100 and 150 AD. Like I say, the consensus is pushing that more towards like 200 now. Even if you take like 125 or something, like the distance between Ephesus, which is where John traditionally is said to have written his gospel, and the site where P52 like comes from is like not that far. Like, I mean, it's far in that it would like take you a few weeks as an ancient traveler to get there, but we're talking about, like, at an early dating of P52, given it 25 years to get there. And that's if it's early. Like, it could be that it had over a century to travel to Egypt to then be discovered there. So, like, all of this, as I say, is speculative, and the consensus is, I like Wes said, it's comfortably 2nd century in the podcast. That was the quote. Like, again, that's not something that I'm going to like pick him up on its own sake. Like, okay, technically Brent Nongbury thinks that we should include like early 3rd century, dates as a possibility. But like, whatever, if he'd have just said, oh, P52 is really interesting, comfortably 2nd century, cool. But it's the fact that he then says that this can give us a 1st century dating of John, because it has to have been, he says, I think the phrases that he uses is, he says that P52 is comfortably early 2nd century. He says maybe even early 2nd century or something like this. And then he says, which means that at a minimum, we can comfortably push John back into the 1st century. Yeah, that is assuming this early date of P52. But that assumption is like essentially an ungrounded one. At least, Wes might have his reasons, but he didn't present them there, and it's not in line with, I think, the academic consensus. So this dating of P52 business should not be used in the way that it is to give a 1st century dating of John.
Sure. Yeah, I would say I would need to see the academic consensus. I've seen both arguments across the spectrum: early dating, young dating. I mean, I think one can argue 1 Corinthians, very early written, and they say that 1 Corinthians 15 creed goes back to within years of Jesus's resurrection. So I've heard that argument made. There's all types of arguments that can be made for this.
Something about what about the resurrection?
1 Corinthians 15. He shows up to the 500. He shows up to these people. He shows up to these people. That's written. I want to say, what is it? 50?
Right. Yeah. So this is really interesting. The idea
that creed that he's reciting to them goes back to the 30s.
Yes,
I've heard that.
Now, how does that creed end?
What do you mean? The creed ends with him with the resurrection claim.
How does that end?
Bodily resurrection, and some are still alive.
Well, he says, yeah, but where does he go? So he says, then they appear to Cephas, then they appear to the 12,
then the 500.
and last of all,
then
the 500, then last of all,
and then to me.
last of all, he appeared to me, right? So
yeah.
It's well known that at some point, if this is some early creed that he's reciting, at some point he breaks off from the creed and is just talking from his own experience, because the creed would not include last of all it appears to me.
Sure.
Maybe that's where he breaks off, but it's not entirely clear, right?
Okay.
So that is an interesting thing to talk about too, like whether that creed is an early sort of part of 1 Corinthians. But like, as I say, all of this is fascinating, and it kind of gets lost in I think a lot of the debate. But this dating of John to the 1st century is
you don't like
dubious.
it.
That's not to say wrong. It's just to say that like it's not. I don't think we can do it with so much confidence. Like, as I've pointed out, I think in the video I pointed this out. Like, there are scholars who are thinking that John is later. There are scholars who are thinking that Luke might be later than John now, because they think it might show some knowledge of the writings of Josephus and this kind of stuff. Like, there's all kinds of stuff like this going on all the time.
Sure.
We just don't know. The only thing that we can really be confident about is like the literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark. Okay. And the dating of Matthew and Luke are highly dependent on the dating of Mark in many ways, except in their lower bound, because we use the destruction of the temple. But then if you're a Christian, maybe Jesus just did accurately predict it. So there's so much going on here.
Well, yeah, because if you're presupposing that he can't, if you're presupposing he can, then you got to date it later. But if you're presupposing he can, then you have no problem with it being early.
Yeah, exactly. So if Wes Huff says, look, P52, I think it's probably mid-2nd century, maybe even early 2nd century. And if that's the case, then given how much time it would take to move around, like, I think we've got a pretty good indication that John might be 1st century. Fine. Mm-hmm. But if you say that P52 is comfortably 2nd century, and therefore at a minimum and comfortably we can push John into the 1st century, I just think that this is again misleading as to what the scholarly consensus actually is. And what it's going to make people believe is that, the Isaiah scroll is word for word identical, and John is super early, and we can know it with confidence.
We came full
circle. The Gospel of Peter, by the way, he does the opposite thing. He does the opposite thing with the Gospel of Peter, the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, which in the podcast he dates between the 2nd and the 4th century, which is like a radically late dating for Peter. Like who thinks it was who thinks it was written in the 4th century? Like can you name a scholar who believes that? I'm sure somebody can, but like it's not very popularly believed. And so it's like there is something a bit unfortunate about the way that when it comes to John or the Isaiah scroll, we're going with the most charitable like understanding of their dating and whatnot. But when it comes to something like the Gospel of Peter, it's the least charitable possible, like dating that would be scholarly, taken scholarly seriously. I think that's kind of interesting. The stuff about Paul as well, I don't think that's been sufficiently addressed in many ways, like by some of the responses about the whole 500 thing. I think that's really interesting about how we don't know who these people are. It's the only time it shows up, and there is an indication that Paul might have been talking about a vision in the sky. There's like so much interesting stuff here. And
there's a lot
the
of
most
interesting stuff
important
there.
thing about it is that's getting lost.
Yeah, I guess what I come back to is there's all sorts of interesting stuff, and that I don't. Yeah, when you say comfortably, I don't like the word comfortably. I don't like this word. Like, that's where I'm like, okay, Alex, like it does seem that we're going back to the full circle moment of the conversation. And even Wes is like, the point of that wasn't an apologetic for it. I think he had a different idea with that, which again he'll address with you whenever he gets around to it.
This is really important though, because of course, like with John's Gospel, let's say, like if we're disputing whether John was written in 90 AD or 120 AD, that's like the difference between whether the eyewitnesses are still alive or not. That's a big deal. Like the difference between 150 and 170 might not be a big deal, but like when you're talking around that kind of time, it makes all the difference as to whether this could have been written by John, the son of Zebedee, which I don't think scholars tend to believe, but that's how tradition has identified it. And certainly whether it's written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses is heavily dependent on these few decades of dating around the turn of the 2nd century. Yeah. And if you're going to rely on P52 to do that, like you're on very fragmented grounding, if you like.
Fair enough. And I'm pretty. Wes was not using P52 as an apologetic argument. He was using it as a story. In terms
as an apologetic for the early dating of John, though, right? Like he was using it as an apologetic for the early dating.
I don't even think I think he was primarily speaking to it being a facsimile, right? In terms of the way he was presenting it to Joe Rogan.
Well, he had this facsimile that he gave to Joe, which was kind of a cute moment. Like that's a cool thing to do. But
I'm sure he can make one for you, Alex.
He brought. I would love one, especially made by Wes Huff. If you could sign it, that'd be cool. There's
I'll pay
one
for it.
In Hebrew.
like he brings it up later. Yeah, let's do it in Coptic or something. He
of the
he brings it up
Isaiah scroll
later.
of the missing verses from Isaiah that you're upset about.
Here they are. I sent them in the post because you said you were missing these. I think that he does bring it up later though, like separate from the. Although I think he presents the facsimile and then maybe talks about it afterwards. But he's just talking about the dating of John, and he says that we can comfortably date John in the first century because of P52. I don't think that's true. That's something that I just don't think is true. And of course, you're probably not gonna want to talk about this in too much depth because this has sort of come up out of nowhere, and you'll want to check your sources, speak to scholars and stuff. But like I mean it when I say like that's also a big deal. It's not nitpicking. It's whether the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, which, as you remember, is one of the main apologetical tools generally that Wes used, like to Joe Rogan when explaining the Gospels.
Yes, depending on when you date the Gospels, and there's early datings and old datings, and there's debate amongst it, and what presuppositions were coming in.
And did you see in my video? What did you think of the idea? I don't know if you watched the video in its entirety, but near the end, I discuss ideas such as the idea that John chapter 21 is a later addition to the Gospel of John. That's a really interesting idea as well.
Which video is this?
In the Wes Huff video, in the original Wes Huff video.
I'd have to go back and see that video.
At the end,
you talk about John being 21 being added later.
That's right.
Okay, and this is in the manuscript.
This is no. We don't have any manuscript evidence for this. This is why it's different from something like the short ending of Mark, where if you read the long version of Mark, you might not think that there's anything weird about it. But if you look at the manuscripts, it's clearly missing. With John 21, it's the opposite. We don't have any early manuscripts, but the earliest manuscripts that we have of complete John will be Codex Vaticanus, I think, or maybe what's the other one? Sinaiticus, right? And those are like 3rd century. So we actually don't have any like super early manuscripts of John in total at all. So manuscript evidence, no. But what we do have is John 21. It's so interesting, man. So like John 20, you remember how it ends? Where Jesus basically, it says like...
well, John 21 is like an epilogue, right? John 21 is
yeah, like but this is the thing. It's got this like epilogue vibe, but like why? So like John chapter 20, I think the ending is something like, and these things are written so that you may also believe, like that's sort of how it's written. So it's like Jesus did many other things, and these things are written so that you may believe. And my friend said to me that when he was reading through the Gospels, he got to that point and thought it was the end. And then he turned the page and was like, oh, it carries on. Okay, that's a bit weird, but like, okay, fair enough. So what happens? Well, in John chapter 20, Jesus has just commissioned his disciples and sent them out and said, go, like you can forgive people's sins. If you forgive their sins are forgiven. Like spread the word. Like he sends them out with this mission. They've met the resurrected Christ. And then you turn the page and they're fishing in Galilee. They've just like gone back to business as usual, as if like nothing has happened, which is kind of strange. Not only this, but this is the first time in John's gospel that the disciples are called fishermen. The rest of John's gospel doesn't seem to know that they're fishermen, but John chapter 21 does. John 21 also has, I think, 28 unique Greek terms that aren't found elsewhere in John chapter 20. Some of them are subject specific, like the word breakfast. Like that makes sense that it's only in John 21. But other ones, like the verb to turn, which there are different ways of saying. The way of saying it in John 21 is a word that doesn't show up anywhere else in John's gospel. Where that word does show up is in the synoptics. You also have Jesus walking across the water and the miraculous catching of fish, which is a miracle that has already occurred in the synoptic gospels, but isn't in John until the very end. So there is this idea that John 21 has been written at a later point by somebody else, or maybe the same author at a later time, who knew about the synoptic gospels, because it's using Greek terms that are in the synoptics, miracles that are in the synoptics. It's showing knowledge of them as fishermen, which is something that we get from the synoptics. And this is really interesting because you ask, well, what happens in John 21? Jesus reinstates Peter. He sort of basically forgives Peter, who's not treated very kindly in John's gospel until you get to John chapter 21. And suddenly it's like, actually, Peter, you're all cool and you're going to be the leader of the church. And in fact, like Peter even turns around to the beloved disciple and says, what about that guy? Why would he be saying that in that context? Well, what about this guy? And Jesus is like, what's it to you? Who cares about this guy? So the idea is that this has been written as a polemic in early Christianity in favor of Petrine leadership of the church. You can imagine like a sort of early power struggle in the church. Peter becomes the leader and some people aren't very happy about that. And John's gospel the Johannites, these guys don't like Peter. They think that maybe the beloved disciple should have been the leader of the church, or somebody else should have been the leader of the church.
Yeah.
And so this chapter is added to reinstate Peter's reputation in Scripture. Now, that is a really interesting theory. It's a really interesting idea. We don't know
think the Catholics,
we don't have any manuscript.
The Catholics would like that.
But I think it is absolutely
very much
fascinating.
I think the Catholics would be very upset at you for this theory of them not liking.
Evan Powell's the unfinished gospel is the book to read on that point. He comes to some pretty extraordinary conclusions, but it's like I think it's an entertaining book to read. I'd recommend it for those.
I'm
reasons.
entertained by how entertained you are by all this stuff, Alex. I'll be honest with you. I think John, the ending of John, it seems to be intentional. Maybe it's not. Maybe it was added by John afterwards. Who knows? I think the general consensus I take away from all of this is that I think there are certain claims that we agree on with regards to the mystery of whatever they were convinced of seeing a bodily risen Jesus. It sounds like you're more open to the idea that it was a mass hallucination event. I'm convinced that he bodily rose from the grave as he predicted he would, and that the scriptures are generally reliable and generally have a historic account of who Jesus is. This is kind of Bart Ehrman's entire point. I'm sure you've seen his debate with Jimmy Akin. And I think from there, people have to, you should watch it. I think you'll actually really like it. I think from there, there's this consensus on Jesus was a historical figure. Jesus was really crucified. All the arguments you've made, and we have to figure out what are we going to do with the resurrection account. It sounds like you're going to default to, hey, I think it was a mass hallucination, or that's the most logical explanation to me. I'm going to say, based on the arguments and the application and transformation in my own life of what Jesus has done for me, I'm going to stick to the idea that Jesus really is who he claimed to be. He predicted his death, he died, and he rose, and he's added the most amount of good to society as a whole. And I think where therein lies, we can talk about all these fascinating things, which I'm genuinely fascinated that you're fascinated by all this stuff. Like, I think it's very interesting. But I ultimately
the reason it matters. Yeah.
Go ahead. Now, I was just gonna say, ultimately, I think people want you to come to a saving faith, Alex. Like, I think that's our heart in having these conversations with you. Even though you're not as non-combative, you are non-resistant, and we're gonna we're praying and hoping that that the Holy Spirit gets a hold of your heart, bro. And I think that's because this stuff can get in the weeds, and a lot of this stuff is beyond anywhere near my area of expertise. You're way smarter than I am in some of this, but I do think ultimately, what do we do with that mystery of the resurrection, and what do we do with the teachings of Jesus, and how do we interact with them? So I'll let you.
What do you do with Matthew 27? Is it 27 or 28? Where it must be 27. Where 17. I think I'm getting mixed up. Wait, Matthew 27. I think it's in Matthew 27. The opening of the tombs. What do you do with that? What do you do with Matthew's narration of the tombs of Jerusalem opening? The holy ones walking around and appearing to many.
Let's go.
Do you think that happened?
Yeah, I think it totally happened. I think he healed Lazarus. He healed the other woman. He raised himself from the dead. Absolutely, I think it happened. I think I don't think it's metaphorical. So it's like he has a pattern of healing people, man. Like, pretty fire. He rose Lazarus from the dead. Like, unequivocally, that is what was stated. And so if he raises Lazarus from the dead, and he raises the girl from the
dead, but loads of dead people walking around Jerusalem and just appearing to people.
I think it's possible, yeah. Likely, I think so. We could look at the exact passage, but yeah,
do you have a thesis as to why that might not be recorded in any other gospel or Acts or Josephus, given that this would be the most extraordinary event in the history of the human species?
Why was it not written into other accounts? Maybe because of who Matthew was writing to. I know in terms of the tombs, the context of those tombs is that the folks who were buried in tombs weren't just regular people; they were more affluent, rich people. So maybe this wasn't as. Say it again?
Are you saying that the Gospels are? Are you saying that the Gospels are written with an agenda?
No.
Have you got the verse?
Yeah, I got the verse. Let me just flesh out this thought. So what I'm saying is, if poor people weren't buried in tombs, perhaps it wasn't this mass event where there's thousands of people coming out as zombies. Perhaps it's just the group of people that were faithful to following the God of the Bible.
Yeah, it's just the holy ones, right? So it's not everybody, but it does say that they appear to many, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if there's thousands going up, but yeah, I believe that there's people that probably got up.
People will say it's an argument from silence for me to say that it's strange that it's not in other materials. But bear in mind that we have 4 accounts that climax at the time this is supposed to have happened, right? And as I say, this would be the most extraordinary event that humans had ever seen. Now, people will later understand that the resurrection of Jesus is like more important, but just like crudely, as like a random guy in Jerusalem, if you see Jesus get up and like walk around, you'd be like, whoa. If you see like a bunch of people getting up and walking around the city, you'd find that more amazing. So this would be for the onlooker the most amazing thing that has ever happened. And yet, though we have multiple accounts writing about the time in which that happened, they just like didn't mention it. It's like not a big deal. I think, along with people like Dale Allison, that this has to be understood as something that did not actually occur. It's unclear whether the author of Matthew's Gospel thought it was a historical event or not. He does seem to sort of write it in a way that parallels some of like Jesus's resurrection. Like it's got a really interesting like structure to like literally the words and the themes that run through this tiny little passage.
But I would say there was no social media back then. I'd say Jesus had risen 2 people from the dead prior to that. That isn't written about in other books, right? Like Lazarus would have been a huge deal. We don't see Josephus writing about Lazarus. We don't see other historians writing about Lazarus. So if it's a couple of people, a handful of people, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't that significant.
Something to do with the fact that there are multiple of them walking around and appearing to many. But the other interesting thing about this verse, if you've got it in front of you, I'm working here from memory, but it says something.
Let me pull it up with both of us on the screen.
Is it this one?
So this
I think you got it. Give me a sec. So
this is the time of Jesus' death, right? So right before this, Jesus dies. This is like when Jesus dies.
Sorry, Alex. I'm trying to pull it on the screen. Give me 1 sec, boss.
Sure.
I had this set up yesterday, and I don't know what I did with it. Goodness. Nope. I can't pull it. I don't know where I put it. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You can.
Everyone pull out their Bibles. I should pull up the verse as well to be sure. But we're talking about the death
like a Sunday morning.
Yeah, sounds like Sunday morning.
The death of Jesus here, right? Like, so Jesus is.
The next day, the one preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. They said, "So remember that is that the no? It's earlier, right?" An evening approached. There was a
cool. All right. So then Jesus cried out in a loud voice and gave up his spirit. So he dies, and then the very next verse. At that moment,
what verse are you in? I'm sorry.
This is verse 51.
Okay, I see it. I got it. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn open.
Jesus. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn open, was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Do you notice anything weird about this? I don't mean weird about the story because obviously it's a very weird story, but do you notice anything weird about the way that this is phrased?
They appear to many holy people. I'm not. I don't know. What would you say is weird?
So when does this occur? Like when does this happen?
At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn. That part?
Sure. So that's the what moment is that?
This is after Jesus gives up his spirit.
Sure. So it's right as he dies. At that moment, the tombs open, and then it says, "The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people." So weirdly, you've got this
jumping ahead. It's like a foreshadowing.
Opening of the tombs, but they appeared to people after their resurrection. Now, like, is this because like they came to life and just like hung out in their tombs for 3 days and then came out? Like it's a really weird thing, unless you think that Matthew is intentionally including what is supposed to be like a vindication of the idea that Jesus is the firstborn of the dead. He's like the resurrection that allows for the general resurrection of the dead. I mean, Jews were looking towards a general resurrection of the dead. Jesus is trying to put himself, or Matthew is trying to present Jesus as the first of these, which brings the resurrection. He is the resurrection. And so he constructs the story so that Jesus gets resurrected first. And yet it's placed here in the narrative at his death.
I got it on the screen.
I think that if you think this is an actual historical event, that is a very unnatural kind of reading. But if you see it as him trying to sort of just like make a theological point, that using something that didn't actually happen, I think it makes a lot more sense. So I think that's kind of interesting too.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think if he is foreshadowing, like jumping ahead in the story at the point of Jesus' resurrection, this happens, and then he goes back into the. I think that's fine as well.
But it says they came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection. It says that like the bodies of many people who had died were restored to life at that moment, and that they came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection, as if they were just. And by the way, that it's the earthquake that opens the tombs. So the tombs are open and the bodies are raised to life, but they don't leave their tombs for another 3 days. It's like really strange, you know?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I'm all for it.
I think that is another indication that we're not dealing with like a historical account here, but we're dealing with the theology. And the problem with that, of course, the obvious problem with that is that if anybody listening, because I don't know how you feel about it, Ruslan, but if anybody listening is more inclined like me to think that this did not actually happen, that means that the author of Matthew's gospel is willing to invent stories about resurrection in order to serve a theological point. Now, given that Matthew is the first gospel that contains resurrection accounts of Jesus, we've led ourselves into some pretty choppy waters, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that the timeline of when the resurrection is presented changes anything about the resurrection happening or not happening, and the mystery that you've talked about in terms of that tomb and Bart Ehrman conceding that they were convinced that Jesus bodily rose from the grave. I don't think the chronological nature or when Matthew said it or if it wasn't in the last 11 verses of Mark changes anything about whether the event happened or it didn't happen. I think this is all fascinating to talk about. I'm just like, oh, yeah, that's cool. You know, that's how I see it.
And our like epistemic warrant for believing in it, you know, like I think that does change that.
Yeah, and I think there's, and I'm sure there's an explanation that it's not literal. Like I'm sure there's a different way someone can explain it. But again, the crux of the Christian faith is the resurrection of Jesus, and then subsequently what follows the resurrection of Jesus and the church that is planted and started. So that's fascinating. Do you let me see if I can hit some of these super chats with while you're here before we wrap. Thank you for doing this, Alex. I appreciate you. Hopefully we do this someday in person. Here's an interesting one from Deadpool. He said, Alex, if you had to join one Christian denomination, which do you believe has the most consistency according to the history of the church and scripture? Uh-oh. This is where Alex would have to pick a jersey.
Mormonism, of course.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing.
We don't consider them Christians. Give me another one.
No, well, that's the interesting thing is that they're sort of often not. I don't even know if they really like to consider themselves Christians as such. I think there's some really interesting. I've been learning a lot about Mormonism. Do you know, by the way, who the first ever U.S. presidential candidate to be assassinated was?
He was a Mormon.
It was Joseph Smith.
Whoa.
Oh, he was a candidate? Joseph Smith was running for the United States?
Yeah, he ran for president.
Wow.
There's a lot of really interesting stuff about
what do you feel about Dan McClellan's Mormonism?
Well, I don't know much about it because he doesn't seem to speak very publicly about it. I quite admire the way that he strictly segregates his personal convictions from his scholarly work, and I think that makes the scholarly work more trustworthy, especially because he admits that they run counter to each other. At least I think he's done that. Like I think he did that. He
did in our conversation. I wonder if that gets him in trouble and like up for any type of like church discipline.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know, but I do admire Dan's scholarly approach. I think he's a quite careful and fair assessor of the Bible. I've got a lot to learn from him for sure. So I don't know anything about his Mormonism, but I think Mormonism's a fascinating religion in many ways. A lot of people aren't aware of its history and also of a lot of its doctrines and theological ideas and its different idea about like what God is and all of this kind of stuff. And the history of persecution of Mormons in the United States is pretty amazing too. You know, like there's so much really interesting stuff. The extermination order of Missouri, where like people were told to just kill them. You know, like it's an unbelievable history. And of course, Joseph Smith dies in a shootout in prison. Like it's one of the most dramatic stories of world religion in the world. Of course, it remains the case that we have, because it's so new, we have better eyewitness testimony to Moroni and the plates than we do, unfortunately, to the resurrection of Jesus, it seems. But that was also a point that raised some eyebrows in my original video, which I found quite entertaining.
Yeah, Alex, let me ask you this, because these questions are kind of all the same that I'm reading, and honestly, none of them they're super interesting. if you could if you can give me like one reason what's keeping you an agnostic, what would that one reason be? Is it the problem of evil? Is there one thing that you can point to, or is it?
It's the few percentage points by which the Masoretic text varies from the Isaiah scroll.
Gosh, darn it! It's the
I'm just kidding.
93 versus 90.
He needed the miracle.
Yeah, look, if it was
Matthew 27:51.
If you can prove that it's 96.3, like then 93.5 is too low. 96.3, then.
But seriously, like, what would it take for you to come?
Look,
to faith in Jesus?
I'm being facetious in part because I don't really have a very good answer to that question because, like, I don't really know. I mean, probably a religious experience.
Okay.
Possibly something like. There'd probably be some like textual stuff, like discovery of some ancient manuscripts. Like if we found the autographs of the canonical Gospels, I think that would be quite insightful. I don't know quite what it would do, but if we found the autographs of Mark and the author identified himself as Mark, for example, as John Mark, I'd be like, hey, that's pretty interesting. That would certainly increase my credence in Christianity. I don't know if it would be enough to make me a Christian, but like, whoa, that would be huge. So there is like stuff like that could happen, but realistically, it'd be some kind of religious experience, you know?
Okay. Shroud of Turin. Have you looked at that?
I was about to say photocopy of Jesus, maybe?
Yeah. The
photocopy of Jesus?
The image beaming out light, and they don't even know how it could have been a forgery or how it could have been recreated.
I think that this is probably a medieval forgery. And I know that people think that the part that was carbon dated was taken from a part of a repair that was done due to damage in a fire in the Middle Ages. But like, I don't think that's the case. I think, again, this isn't my area of expertise, but when I've looked into this, I'm like, okay, so our first written record of the Shroud of Turin shows up in the Middle Ages at a time when religious art was like known for its particular emphasis on like flagellation and this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it shows up in such a way that the Pope at the time, I think, says that it's a forgery and like just like flatly says that this isn't the burial cloth of Jesus. And then, so that's why years later, the Catholic Church started allowing you to display it, but I think they had to put a disclaimer that it's like not the real burial cloth or something like that. Like the Pope Francis did pray in front of it some time recently. But okay, so it first shows up like in our records in the Middle Ages. The Pope thinks it's a forgery at the time. The carbon dating puts it to roughly like the same kind of place. I'm sort of like
you're a 13th century Catholic right now with all this. What about the modern updates that it was in the first century and that it was dated back to the same area that Jesus came from? There's been some development on that.
Sometime last year, like everybody started talking about this development, but that was a development. Like whatever they were pointing to, the study or whatever it was, that was actually
several years ago.
But for some reason, it just like randomly resurfaced. It didn't do it for me. I think that like. I mean, it's an interesting specimen, of course, but I do think that it begins to get a bit borderline conspiratorial when people like really go deep on the on the Shroud of Turin. But like I say, I kind of don't know what I'm talking about, and it's also one of those topics that people seem like extremely excited about, such that like even just me saying what I've said here, with a good healthy sprinkling of recognized ignorance will be enough to annoy a lot of people, probably more than anything else that I've said. But I think there is something great about thought that the physical evidence of Christianity might be physical. You know, if this was the burial cloth of Jesus, the idea that, because then you'd have to accept that at least Jesus died and was crucified in this way, you know, like the idea that it would be a physical, tangible bit of evidence would be really interesting.
Well,
but
the light,
I'm suspicious
the photo
of
negative of it. The photo negative of it is what they're saying they can't explain away, even
so that's
if
the
it is
interesting
a forgery.
thing. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not a scientist and haven't looked into that, but I think
might be your miracle, Alex.
I think people have like tried to attempt to redo it and they haven't managed it or whatever. Like, maybe it is a miracle. Maybe it is the burial cloth of Jesus, but like
maybe that's
like,
the real
I don't
miracle.
know, man.
Zach thinks that's the miracle you need.
Well, that's the real miracle West Huff should have brought up on the show. Just kidding. I think they did talk about that.
Doesn't the church like not allow further? They're like not allowing further study on it or something. I don't know. I don't want to say these things.
It always goes back. It always goes back and forth.
It's a bit of a trouble. But yeah, I'm not really on that.
Fair enough. Alex, you look tired. I don't want to keep you long. I know it's late over in the UK. And listen, thank you for doing this. The chat wants you to know that we're still praying for you. We're holding out hope. We think 35-year-old Alex might have a different, little pep in his step when it comes to Jesus. So we'll see. But man, this was fun, man. Thank you for doing this. I'm looking forward to hopefully
you'll be the first to know if that happens, and surely the first person to make a. Well, you'll be among the first to know in the sense that I'll announce it in some sense, and I'm sure that you will be among the first.
We will be the quickest to the reaction
to make a response video.
There we go.
Absolutely,
Boom.
We will get you. We'll get you covered.
I'm sure that's
man, thank you for doing this, man. I know it's late over there. This was fun. Hopefully, it was encouraging. Hopefully, people gained value from it. Hopefully, you found the conversation pleasant. And just so you know, this stream goes down. We'll probably chop the full thing down and repackage it, and then you'll see clips come out of it.
We'll probably trim down the commercials, the opening of the West Huff part, and then the remaining topics that we hit after will be the
So you'll see clips of this.
I mean, obviously that's fine. I don't know how it is that you chop it up, because I think that especially if you're chopping up the stuff on West Huff, which is like the sort of hot topic stuff that people are talking about, then I would want to be careful.
We're gonna leave that. We're gonna leave that part in its entirety on the live stream, and then we're just gonna trim. We're going to leave that up in its entirety, and then we're going to trim the parts where we start talking about the problem of evil, and those will be individual topics. And the only stuff we chop out of those is like long gaps or like commercials. Other than that, we leave them
no content
untouched. No, we don't chop out content.
Yeah, but it'll be unlisted while we chop down the beginning of the
stream.
Sure,
yeah, that's fine too. I just want to make sure that, because there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, and I can see why there might be a motivation to maybe chop out some of that stuff about John 21 or anything like that. So.
Yeah, the full thing will be left up.
That's fine.
We don't want to take you out of context, so we'll leave the full thing up, and you'll see clips of it coming out on the Blessed God Studios channel. Alex, you're the man, man. Appreciate you. Looking forward to meeting you. Thank you so much. We're gonna get out of here, and hopefully we do this again sometime. All right.
Sure. God bless.
God bless you, my guy. Alex O'Connor, ladies and gentlemen. What about that? What a pleasant lad, huh? That was fun.
That was wonderful.
That was fun. That was 3.5 hours. So much for another stream, huh? Another after party stream.
We got it, dude.
That was good.
Let's take a 45-minute break. Let's end the stream.
All right, I'm down.
Let's end the stream now. It's actually going to redirect to the channel video.
Oh, okay, yeah. Go back. We can watch our how God is using Alex to reach thousands of people video, which we think is funny. No, I thought that was good. I thought that was exhaustive. That dude is super smart. I didn't know he was only 25. Goodness gracious. He's
Look at you. In one show, you had two brilliant 25 and 26-year-olds.
Gosh, man. I'm the oil. The oil. No, that was fun, man. I'm not gonna lie. I think that was a lot, and I think that was probably a lot for him. Though he could kick. He wasn't tapping out. No, he was gonna keep going. So I'm all for it. I like Alex, man. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Are you not entertained?
Are you not entertained?
So hey, this will be unlisted, and then it will be chopped down. The beginning, and this will be trimmed down, and then you'll see it go back up. So if you're like, oh, I want to find, and then we'll try to clip up the topics tomorrow and get it out on the Blessed God Studios channel. So hopefully you guys enjoy this. All right, guys, we're out of here. We love you guys.